Story 1.
Waking up early in the morning, I felt the first rays of the sun breaking through the curtains and gently touching my face. I lay in bed, listening to the silence before getting up to brew myself a strong coffee. My apartment's kitchen was small but cozy, with worn-out cabinets and an old refrigerator. At that moment, the phone rang, breaking the morning tranquility. It was Officer Johnson. His voice was tense and serious. "Sam, we need you to come over as soon as possible. There's been a murder near the Wild Coyote bar. It's something you've never seen before." Glancing at the clock, I realized it was not even 7 in the morning yet. I quickly put on jeans, a shirt, and a leather jacket, grabbed my keys, and rushed out of the apartment. My car, old but reliable, awaited me in the parking lot. Starting the engine, I felt adrenaline begin to circulate through my veins. The drive to the crime scene took about 20 minutes, giving me time to gather my thoughts. The city was just waking up. Shops were opening, people were hurrying to work, and I drove through the winding streets, watching the sun rise over the horizon. The route to the bar took me through old neighborhoods with peeling buildings and abandoned warehouses that seemed frozen in time. Despite this everyday scenery, a sense of unease grew within me. When I arrived at the scene, the bar looked even more desolate in the morning light. Officers had already cordoned off the alley with yellow tape, and I noticed a few curious onlookers gathered nearby. Johnson was waiting for me at the entrance, and the expression on his face did not bode well. "What do we have here, Johnson?" I asked, getting out of the car and walking closer. "Something gruesome." His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "This is something entirely different. It looks like the victim was torn apart by an animal. We've never seen anything like it." I followed him to the crime scene. The alley behind the bar was narrow and dirty, with trash cans and food remnants scattered everywhere. But the most horrifying sight was what I saw in the center of this scene. The body of a young woman lay in a pool of blood, her clothes torn, and she looked as if she had been attacked by a giant beast. Deep, ragged wounds covered her body, and I could barely keep myself from feeling sick. "That's not all," Johnson added, pointing to the ground a bit further away. "Look at these tracks." I bent down and saw footprints leading from where the body lay. The prints were large, belonging to a man. But what struck me even more were the deep scratches mixed with the footprints on the ground, as if someone or something had fought desperately here. "It looks like she was tied up first," Johnson said, pointing to the remnants of rope lying nearby. "We found rope marks on her wrists and ankles." I examined the found items. The phone was broken, and the purse looked as if it had been turned inside out in search of something valuable. This looked too strange for a typical robbery. "Whoever did this tortured her savagely before killing her," I said quietly, feeling a wave of anger and horror rising within me. "Her name was Jessica Williams," Johnson said sadly. My thoughts raced, trying to find any logical explanation. Was this the first such murder, or just the first we knew about? Either way, I felt there was something more behind this. "We need to talk to the bartender and interview everyone who was here last night," I said, trying to pull myself together. "And also, let's check all the surveillance cameras around. Maybe we can find some clue." Johnson nodded and went off to carry out my instructions. I stood at the crime scene, carefully examining every inch, hoping to find some clue. The tracks on the ground, the remnants of the rope, the blood, all of this should tell its story, but for now, it was incomplete. Raising my head, I glanced at the crowd of onlookers gathered nearby. Their curious gazes and whispers were somewhat irritating. My eyes stopped on one person. He stood a bit apart, wrapped in a dark cloak and hat that hid his face. His figure seemed suspicious, too concealed among the rest. As soon as I focused on him and took a step in his direction, the person abruptly turned and disappeared around the corner, vanishing in an instant. My detective instincts kicked in. Who was this person? Why did he disappear so quickly as soon as he noticed my interest? Questions swirled in my head, but before I could take any action, Johnson returned. "Find anything?" he asked, noticing my tense gaze in the direction where the suspicious person had recently stood. "Maybe," I replied, nodding in that direction. "I saw someone who didn't want to be noticed, but it's just a hunch for now. Let's go check the cameras." We headed to the bar, where the security room with surveillance monitors was located. The bartender nervously chewed his lip as we entered and hurried to give us access to the recordings. Johnson quickly set up the video, and we began reviewing the footage from the night. The screen showed images of patrons drinking and chatting. Soon we saw Jessica. She was sitting at a table when a tall man with dark hair, dressed in a jacket and jeans, approached her. They began talking. The video showed the man charmingly smiling, and Jessica seemed captivated by him. "There he is," Johnson said quietly, pointing at the screen. "That's the last person she interacted with." We continued watching as they got up and left the bar, heading toward the alley. Unfortunately, the cameras didn't cover that area, and the recording ended as they disappeared around the corner. "Well, we have something to start with," I said, tearing my eyes away from the screen. "Now we need to find out who this man is and what he was doing in the alley with Jessica." As a true detective, I knew the next step was to interview all the witnesses in the bar who might have seen this man. Perhaps someone knew him, or at least saw where he went after leaving the alley. "Johnson, start gathering information. Find everyone who was in the bar that night and interview them," I ordered. "And I'll check the other cameras in this area. Maybe we can find some trace of this person. And one more thing," I added, turning to him. "Put out an APB on him. Tall man, black hair, jacket, and jeans. We need all patrol officers to be aware and on the lookout. If he was here that night, he could be dangerous." Johnson immediately set to work, relaying the description over the radio to all available officers. The image of the mysterious man in the cloak and hat, whom I had seen among the onlookers, still lingered in my mind. What if he was the killer? Or at the very least, someone who knew more than he was letting on. A week passed since Jessica Williams's murder, and every day I waited for a breakthrough. But the suspect seemed to have vanished into thin air. Witness interviews yielded no results, and surveillance footage didn't provide any new information. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, and I started to feel frustrated. That week, I spent more time in my office than at home. The stacks of cases and reports on my desk grew each day, but there was no real progress in the investigation. I was almost losing hope when the phone suddenly rang. "Sam, we've got another murder." Johnson's voice was tense. "This time on the outskirts of town, near the abandoned factory. The victim is another girl, and the killing resembles the previous one." I grabbed my coat and dashed out of the office without wasting a minute. The car started on the first try, and I sped through the streets of the city, heading towards the abandoned factory. The road was long and winding, and I felt the tension build up inside me. Something in Johnson's voice told me this murder was not just a repeat, but something more. When I arrived at the scene, it was already cordoned off with yellow tape, and several patrol officers stood guard, keeping curious onlookers at bay. The abandoned factory loomed before me like a grim monument of the past. Ruined buildings with broken windows and rusted iron structures looked eerie in the morning light. Everything here spoke of neglect and oblivion. The onlookers gathered around the crime scene were locals and teenagers drawn to the macabre scene. Among them, I noticed a few teenagers who were clearly frightened and not hiding their emotions. "What happened here?" I asked one of the officers standing at the entrance. "Local kids found the body," he replied, pointing to a group of boys who looked pale and scared. "They often come here looking for adventure." I nodded and approached Johnson, who was waiting for me at the entrance to the factory grounds. "Sam, this looks just like what happened to Jessica," he said as I came closer. "But this time there's something new." He led me through the overgrowth to the crime scene. Weeds and bushes broke through the cracks in the asphalt, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I smelled death and blood as I saw the girl's body. She lay on the ground, her clothes torn, her body covered in deep wounds. I had seen these horrific marks just a week ago, but what I saw next truly shocked me. Nearby, a strange wooden symbol, looking like an ancient amulet, was carved, and on the tree next to the victim, there were signs drawn that I couldn't immediately recognize. These symbols added an extra layer of horror to the scene. "What the hell?" I whispered, examining the marks on the tree. "This is something new." "Yes," Johnson replied, nodding. "We don't know what it means yet, but someone clearly left these signs deliberately." I took a deep breath, trying to calm down and gather my thoughts. Whatever was behind these murders, it was more than just brutal attacks. It was something ritualistic, possibly occult. I continued to examine the crime scene, studying every detail carefully. The dirty walls of the abandoned factory, the rusty metal structures, and the dense vegetation created a grim atmosphere. I crouched to take a closer look at the strange symbol carved on the piece of wood when suddenly something caught my attention. Raising my head, I saw him. In the window of one of the abandoned buildings stood the same man in the hat and cloak. His dark figure stood out against the bright morning. As soon as our eyes met, he instantly turned and disappeared from sight. "Johnson!" I shouted, jumping to my feet. "He's here in the building! Run after me!" Without losing a second, I dashed in pursuit. We ran towards the building where I had seen the man. The old creaky door yielded to my push, and we burst inside. Narrow corridors, peeling walls, and heaps of trash hindered movement, but I didn't stop. The man could disappear at any moment. We ran through the corridors, leaping over obstacles and dodging debris scattered everywhere. I heard distant footsteps echoing through the building. He was somewhere ahead, and I wasn't going to let him slip away again. We emerged onto the second floor, where the corridors became even more maze-like. I saw a shadow flicker and rushed after it. The man was quick and agile, as if he knew every corner of this labyrinth. We raced through several rooms, going up and down stairs, navigating through thick dust and cobwebs. At one turn, I almost knocked Johnson over, who was keeping up with me. We continued the chase until we reached a large workshop, where concrete columns and metal beams created a real labyrinth. In the distance, I saw his figure again, slipping behind one of the columns. "There!" I shouted, pointing to the spot. We ran further, but when we reached the place where he should have been, he was already gone. I stopped, panting heavily, looking around. Emptiness and silence greeted me. The man had vanished once more, leaving us bewildered. "Damn it," I exhaled, looking around. "He got away." Johnson approached me, also trying to catch his breath. "How does he do that?" he asked, waving his arms in frustration. "He's like a ghost." "I don't know, but we have to find him," I replied, trying to calm down. "He knows something. Or more likely, he is our killer." We slowly began to search the building, hoping to find some clue. But the man in the hat had slipped away again, leaving us with the same questions and an even greater sense of failure. "We need to increase surveillance in this area and interview everyone who might know something," I said, turning to Johnson. "Let's go. We have a lot of work to do." We left the abandoned building, leaving behind yet another failed attempt to catch the mysterious man. But I was determined. We would find him. Sooner or later, we would find him. We finished collecting evidence at the crime scene. Photos, blood samples, footprints on the ground. We carefully packed everything and sent it to the lab. The symbols and markings on the tree were photographed from different angles for detailed examination later. When all necessary procedures were completed, we left the abandoned factory, leaving it shrouded in a grim silence. The next day, around noon, I received a call from the lab with news. The DNA analysis results from the first murder, Jessica Williams' murder, were ready. I immediately headed there, hoping to find some clue. "Detective Greenberg, the DNA analysis results showed something strange," said the lab technician when I arrived. "We found DNA traces that don't match any known animal species. It's something completely new." "What do you mean by completely new?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "We can't identify it," the lab technician replied, shrugging. "It doesn't resemble any known creature. It's something entirely mysterious." My thoughts whirled. An unknown type of DNA? This added even more questions to an already complicated case. What kind of creature could leave such traces? Were they connected to the mysterious man in the hat, whom we couldn't catch? I took the photos from the crime scene and headed to the local university to see a professor who specialized in the occult. If anyone could shed light on these signs and symbols, it was him. The drive to the university took about half an hour. Passing by old buildings and cozy cafes, I tried to gather my thoughts. The university was on the outskirts of town. Its ancient buildings with high spires and Gothic architecture looked majestic and imposing. Parking the car, I headed to the main building. Entering, I felt an atmosphere of academic rigor and ancient knowledge. Marble floors, wood-paneled walls, and the quiet murmur of students discussing their research created a unique aura. I approached the reception and asked where I could find Professor William Crowley. I was directed to his office on the 3rd floor. Climbing the old staircase, I felt the tension rising within me. Finally, I found the right door with a plaque reading, "Professor William Crowley, Department of Occult Sciences." Knocking, I heard a muffled "come in" and pushed the door open. The professor's office was filled with books and strange artifacts. Ancient maps and drawings hung on the walls, and in the corner, a dim lamp illuminated a desk cluttered with papers and manuscripts. Professor Crowley was an elderly man with a thick gray beard and deep wrinkles, telling of many years of research. His eyes, despite his age, shone with lively interest and intellect. "Detective Greenberg, come in," he said, gesturing to a chair opposite his desk. "I've been expecting you. I've already been informed about your case." "Thank you, Professor," I replied, sitting down and laying out the photos on the table. "We have a series of murders, and I hope you can help us understand these symbols and signs." Professor Crowley took the photos and began studying them intently, tracing his fingers over the images with evident interest. I watched him, hoping he could shed light on this darkness. Suddenly he frowned and set one of the photos aside. "Detective Greenberg," he began slowly, as if carefully choosing his words. "I know who these symbols belong to." I tensed, preparing to hear something important. "These signs belong to an occult group operating in our city. They call themselves the Followers of Dusk. These people are very secretive and murky. They've never been involved in any crimes, so they've been left alone. But they're crazy. They believe in the coming of an ancient god they call Nocturnus." "Nocturnus?" I repeated, feeling chills run down my spine. Yes, Crowley nodded. Nocturnus, the god of darkness and chaos. Their organization is quite secretive, and I don't know its members. They perform their rituals in abandoned places, away from prying eyes. No one knows how many of them there are or what exactly they do. But their beliefs and rites are clearly dark and dangerous. Do we have any leads? Places where they might gather? I asked, feeling close to a breakthrough. The professor thought for a moment, then continued. Witnesses have seen such signs at an abandoned church outside the city near an old cemetery. This is the only place I can suggest for further investigation. The church hasn't been used for a long time and is often visited by various occult groups. An abandoned church, I repeated, noting the address. This could be what we're looking for. Thank you, Professor. Be careful, Detective, Crowley warned me. The followers of dusk can be very dangerous. If they're indeed involved in these murders, you're treading on dark and dangerous territory. I nodded and thanked him for his help, then gathered the photos and left the university. My thoughts were occupied with what I had learned. A cult believing in an ancient god, ritualistic murder signs. It all seemed fantastical, but I knew this was a reality I had to face. I got into my car and headed to the abandoned church. The road led me out of town through wooded areas and deserted fields. The old cemetery area had been abandoned for many years, surrounded by gloomy shadows and dense vegetation. When I arrived, the church stood before me, majestic and ravaged by time. Its stone walls were covered with moss and mold, and the windows were broken and boarded up. The place seemed steeped in eternal neglect. I exited the car and headed towards the entrance, feeling adrenaline surge through my veins. The church looked even more sinister inside than outside. Dim light filtered through the broken windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The floor was covered in dust and debris, and the ceiling sagged in places, threatening to collapse. In the corners lay old church pews and broken statues of saints. The whole space was imbued with a sense of abandonment and oblivion. I slowly looked around, moving forward step by step. In the center of the hall stood an altar, flanked by ancient candelabras whose candles had long since burned out. I noticed strange symbols painted on the walls, similar to those on the last victim's body. This place was clearly used for occult rituals. After a thorough inspection, I decided the best course of action was to set up surveillance. Hiding the car in nearby bushes, I took a position near the church entrance, waiting for possible visitors. I also called Johnson, and soon we were both in a stakeout, watching the church. A couple of days passed, and one night we saw car headlights slowly approaching the church. I tensed up in anticipation, my heart beating faster. A group of people began to get out of the cars. They were dressed in robes and masks that hid their faces. The masks were creepy, depicting various demonic faces, and in the headlights' glow, they looked even more terrifying. We were ready. I gestured to Johnson to be quiet and cautious. The robed figures started to gather at the church, their movements smooth and synchronized. They made no sound except for the rustling of their robes on the ground. Once they entered the church, we carefully followed them. Inside it was dark and quiet, only the faint light from the lanterns they carried illuminating the way. We moved through the hall, trying not to make any noise. The church seemed empty, but suddenly I noticed something strange on the floor by the altar. It was a hidden passage under one of the old boards that I hadn't discovered earlier. "Look," I whispered to Johnson, pointing to the entrance. We opened the hatch and started descending a narrow staircase leading down. The corridor was dark and narrow, the walls covered in moss and mold. The smell of dampness and decay grew stronger as we moved forward. At the end of the corridor, we found a large cave. When we entered, we saw a circle of people standing around a stone altar. They were chanting something in a strange, unfamiliar language. In the center of the circle lay bizarre objects: animal skulls, candles, and amulets. The torchlight reflected off the cave walls, creating a sinister atmosphere. "What the hell are they doing?" Johnson whispered, peering at the scene. We stayed in the shadows, observing the ritual. My hand gripped my weapon tightly, ready for anything. The robed figures continued their chants, and I felt darkness and a malevolent energy filling the cave. Suddenly, one of the participants stepped into the center of the circle. He held a small vessel filled with a dark liquid. In complete silence, he raised the vessel to his lips, lifted his mask, and drank the contents in one gulp. The chanting resumed, but this time with greater intensity. Unexpectedly, the man began to writhe and scream in pain, his body contorting as if a battle was raging inside him. The chanting continued, the other participants ignoring his suffering. My composure, reinforced by years on the job, cracked, shouting, "Freeze, police!" I sprang from my hiding place, aiming my weapon at the ritual participants. The chanting stopped, but the man's screams continued. Everyone stood still, staring at me with cold, terrifying eyes. "You're all under arrest!" I shouted, but no one moved. Silence hung heavy in the air, oppressive. I decided to act. I approached one of the robed figures and reached for his mask to see who was hiding beneath it. But as soon as my fingers touched the mask, all the other participants scattered. Johnson tried to grab someone, but it happened too quickly. In the chaos, I was left alone with the screaming man on the ground. As I got closer, I removed his mask and saw something horrifying. Beneath it was the face of a wolf monster. His eyes burned with rage and pain, and his fangs glistened in the dim torchlight. He continued to writhe and scream, his body transforming before my eyes. Johnson and I stood there, unsure of what to do. The man was morphing into a creature from our worst nightmares. He howled, the sound piercing the cave's silence, his angry gaze fixed on us. I couldn't hold back and fired. The bullet hit his chest, but he didn't seem to care. I emptied almost the entire magazine, but the creature kept advancing. Panic set in. I knew we didn't stand a chance in an open fight with this monster. "Run!" I shouted to Johnson, and we dashed for the exit. We sprinted through the cave corridors, hearing the creature's angry growls and heavy footsteps behind us. The corridor walls blurred into a single mass, and each step was a struggle. My only thought was to escape and warn others. We burst outside, barely maintaining our balance on the slippery stairs. "Johnson, faster!" I yelled, pushing him forward. We ran to the car. The howls behind us told me the creature was close. We jumped into the car, and I started the engine without wasting a second. We sped down the winding road when suddenly the creature leaped onto the hood. It smashed the windshield, tearing it out of the frame. A massive, clawed paw reached into the cab, grabbed Johnson, and yanked him out with such force he flew to the roadside, hitting the ground hard. I kept driving despite the horror and desperation, praying that my partner would be okay. I swerved along the road, trying to lead the beast away from Johnson. The creature seemed unstoppable. Its claws reached for me, tearing at the remains of the windshield. I had no choice but to take a desperate step. I aimed the car straight at a tree. The impact was devastating. A moment of pain, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, my head was pounding and my ears were ringing. I saw the creature slowly rising from the ground and heading towards me. Panic set in. I struggled out of the car, feeling pain with every movement, and started running down the road. My legs wobbled, my breath was ragged, but fear drove me forward. The creature was closing in, its angry growls growing louder. In the darkness of the night, I raced down the road, trying to escape the inevitable. The creature was almost upon me when suddenly a gunshot rang out. The beast howled in pain and retreated. I turned to see what was happening. For a moment, I thought I had survived. Looking around, I searched for my savior. Then I saw him. The same man in the hat stood by the roadside holding a rifle. His dark figure stood out against the night forest, his eyes glowing with a cold light. He slowly lowered the rifle, and the creature, whimpering and growling, disappeared into the forest. I stood there, breathing heavily, still feeling the adrenaline in my veins. The joy of surviving mixed with confusion and fear. Who was this man? Why did he help me? I took a step forward, but the words stuck in my throat. "Who are you?" I finally asked, my voice trembling. The man in the hat didn't answer immediately. His face was hidden in shadow, and only his eyes glowed in the dark. "I am the one who knows what darkness lurks in this world," he said in a quiet but firm voice. "And I am here to fight it." I was stunned. This man knew more than I could have imagined. He saved me, but who was he really? And what role did he play in this horrifying game? "Thank you," I said, still trying to process what had happened. "You saved my life." The man nodded, but his face remained inscrutable. He then approached me, pulling out a note from his pocket. His eyes shone with determination and weariness. "You can find me at this address," he said quietly, handing me the note. "We have a lot to discuss." Before I could say anything or stop him, he turned and quickly disappeared into the night's shadows. With trembling hands, I pulled out the radio and called for backup. The words tumbled from my lips faster than I could comprehend what had happened. "Urgent. Need assistance. We're on the road by the old church. Officer down. Need an ambulance and backup." My voice was shaky but resolute. Dropping the radio, I ran back to Johnson. Luckily, he was alive, though he looked exhausted and pale. He had several broken bones, but nothing life-threatening. "Are you all right, partner?" I asked, trying to keep him conscious. "Damn, Sam," he croaked, barely opening his eyes. "What was that thing?" "I don't know, but we'll find it. The ambulance is on the way. Hang in there." I squeezed his hand, trying to pass on some of my courage. Soon, sirens pierced the night's silence, and the police and ambulance arrived. The medics began to attend to Johnson, carefully placing him on a stretcher and loading him into the ambulance. I watched them leave, feeling a bitter taste of failure for not preventing his injury. The arriving officers began to examine the area. We searched for traces of the people, but they had skillfully disappeared, leaving no clues. The only thing left was the monster's tracks, deep claw marks on the road, and the wrecked car. I recounted my story to the duty officer, but from his look, I knew he didn't believe me. However, the tracks and evidence left by the creature made everyone reconsider. "Are you seriously saying this was some kind of monster?" one of the officers asked, raising an eyebrow skeptically. "See for yourself," I replied, pointing to the deep scratches and the wrecked car. "A human couldn't have done this, and I have a witness, my partner." After that, the standard procedures began: collecting evidence, photographing the scene, and questioning witnesses. I felt drained and exhausted, but knew the work wasn't over. The next day, I decided not to delay and head to the address left by the mysterious man in the hat. The sky was covered with gray clouds, and a light drizzle had been falling since the morning, as if nature itself was mourning what had happened. The gloomy weather added to the somber atmosphere, perfectly fitting the thoughts that had tormented me since the night's encounter. I gathered my things and checked my weapon, mentally preparing for what might await me. Mixed feelings of anxiety, fear, and curiosity wouldn't leave me, making my heart beat faster. I couldn't wrap my head around what had happened, and I hoped this mysterious man could shed some light on this dark mystery. I got in the car and set off. The address pointed to a place in the forest at the foot of the mountains, in a small village lost among dense woods. The road was long and winding, snaking through endless forested expanses that seemed infinite. The light rain drummed on the car roof, creating a monotonous rhythm that accompanied my thoughts. Soon, I reached the village. It looked as if it was stuck in time. Old houses with sagging roofs, overgrown gardens, and narrow streets barely wide enough for a car. The locals watched me with curiosity and wariness, as if I were an outsider disrupting their usual way of life. The mysterious man lived apart from the others, his house at the edge of the village right by the forest. It was an old wooden house surrounded by tall trees, creating a sense of isolation and seclusion. The house looked sturdy despite its age and was well maintained. A narrow path led to the porch where he stood, waiting for me. I stopped the car and got out, trying to hide my anxiety. The man nodded to me, inviting me inside. The house was cozy inside, filled with the smell of wood and old books. Hunting trophies and paintings depicting scenes of forest life hung on the walls. As I entered the house, the man extended his hand and introduced himself. "My name is Victor," he said with a slight smile. "I imagine you have many questions. You saw that creature in person, so it'll be easier for you to believe my story." He led me to the kitchen, where he poured me a cup of hot tea. We sat at a wooden table, and Victor began to tell his story, full of tragedy and horror. "It all started many years ago," he began, looking out the dark window, where the light drizzle continued to fall. "In our village there was a man named Henry Ellison. He was strange from childhood. No one paid much attention to him because he always mumbled to himself and looked like a typical village oddball. But he hid a dark side no one knew about. Henry was fascinated by the occult and ancient manuscripts that he collected from all over the world. He conducted his rituals in secret, deep in the forest. One night he recited a spell that summoned the first monster. This creature killed my family. My sister Emily and my father James were its victims. I was a teenager, but that night changed my life forever. My family was always connected to the forest," Victor continued, stroking his cup. "My father, James Grayson, was a respected woodsman and hunter. He knew every corner of the forest, every trail. From childhood, he taught me and my younger sister Emily to respect nature and live in harmony with it. Emily was 7 years younger than me, and we were always very close. She loved listening to our father's stories about forest spirits and magical creatures. Her laughter filled our home, making it a bright and warm place. But everything changed one night. It was a full moon, and my father went on his usual patrol of the forest. He always took Emily with him to show her the beauty of the night forest. I stayed home, helping my mother with the chores. But something was wrong that night. My father didn't return on time. My mother began to worry, and we decided to go look for them. When we reached the edge of the forest, we saw something horrifying." Victor paused for a moment, and his eyes filled with pain. I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to his story. "We found their bodies, mutilated and torn apart. That sight is impossible to forget. I screamed, trying to do something, but it was too late. That night, I lost not only my father and sister, but also a part of myself. My mother couldn't bear the loss, and soon left this world too, leaving me alone. After my family's death, I swore to take revenge. I studied everything I could find about these creatures and how to fight them. After a few years, I tracked Henry down. He had disappeared from the village but continued his dark deeds. He had garnered the support of influential people who believed in his power and promises. Now they're preparing something, and I'm sure it's nothing good. What exactly are they preparing? I asked, feeling the anxiety grow inside me. I don't know for sure, Victor replied, shaking his head. We sat in silence while the tea cooled in our cups. Suddenly, Victor stood up, his gaze serious and full of determination. I found out they're gathering tonight for something important, he said, looking me straight in the eye. Are you ready to come with me? I nodded uncertainly, thoughts racing about whether I should call for backup. But Victor, as if reading my mind, added, "We should go alone if you don't want any unnecessary casualties. These creatures are dangerous and unpredictable." With that, he led me to the garage attached to his house. When we entered, I saw that it was not just a garage, but a real arsenal. The walls were lined with all kinds of weapons: rifles, pistols, crossbows, and bows. Shelves held various traps, knives, and swords. Victor knew his business, and this place spoke of his preparedness and serious intentions. As an officer, I wanted to ask if he had a permit for all this arsenal, but I understood that now was not the time for formalities. Victor approached one of the shelves and took out a massive rifle. "These creatures can't be killed with regular ammo," he said, showing me the silver bullets. "You need to use silver. It's the only way to stop them." He opened a drawer and pulled out several cartridges, each bullet gleaming in the dim garage light. I felt the gravity of the situation increasing with each second. Victor handed me the rifle and a silver dagger, which looked like a true work of art with engraved symbols. "Take this," he said, handing me the weapon. "These creatures are strong and fast. We need to be ready for anything." I took the rifle, feeling its weight, and calmly checked the cartridges. The silver dagger was surprisingly sharp, its blade gleaming in the lamp's light. I felt the cold metal seep into my hand, which added to my confidence. We began to arm ourselves, carefully checking every detail. Victor donned leather gloves and a bulletproof vest, preparing for the fight. I followed his example, putting on a bulletproof vest and ensuring all the bullets were in place. "We're heading into the lion's den," Victor said, looking at me. "Be prepared for any outcome. We don't know what awaits us there." When we were ready, Victor opened the garage door and we stepped into the night. The rain was still drizzling, adding to the somber atmosphere. We got into his old SUV and set off. We drove down the wet road, the light rain tapping on the SUV's roof, creating a monotonous, soothing sound. The headlights picked out the silhouettes of trees that seemed to lean towards us like ancient forest guardians. The forest was thick and dark, with wet foliage and creaking branches, creating the feeling that nature itself was watching us. Soon, we reached the outskirts of the city. The streets were empty, the windows of houses dark, with only the occasional streetlight shining. The rain intensified, and the puddles on the road turned into small streams. We passed abandoned factories and warehouses that looked like ghosts of the past, deserted and forgotten. "We're almost there," Victor said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence inside the car. We turned onto a narrow road leading out of the city, and I immediately knew where we were headed. On the outskirts of town lay an abandoned amusement park. I knew this place from my childhood. It was once full of life, children's laughter and joy. But over time it was abandoned, and now stood as a place shrouded in a ghostly atmosphere. As we approached the park, it looked even more eerie than I remembered. The entrance was boarded up, and the old rusty gates creaked in the wind. Beyond them stretched darkness, illuminated only by occasional flashes of lightning. "This is it," Victor said, stopping the car and turning off the engine. "We're here." We got out of the car, and I felt the cold rain immediately soak through my clothes. The amusement park was enveloped in darkness and silence. In the distance, the outline of the old Ferris wheel loomed like a giant skeleton, frozen in eternal waiting. The carousels and rides that once brought joy to children now looked sinister and menacing. We approached the gates, and Victor carefully moved one of the boards, creating a passage. Inside, the park looked even more abandoned. Food and drink stands were covered in mold, and old ticket booths were ruined and deserted. We walked along a path overgrown with grass and bushes, trying not to make any noise. The rain intensified, and thick fog enveloped the old carousels and rides, giving them a ghastly appearance. The Ferris wheel stood like a giant skeleton, its rusty spokes creaking in the wind, creating ghostly sounds. Ruined kiosks and pavilions looked like long-forgotten graves hidden in this eerie place. Wet grass and mud squelched underfoot, and the cold wind blew through us. Around us was dead silence, broken only occasionally by the rustle of leaves and the sound of raindrops falling on metal and wood. We advanced through the park, carefully observing and listening to every sound. In the distance, we saw the silhouettes of people gathered in a circle. They stood still, their robes billowing in the wind, and masks hid their faces. Victor motioned for me to stop, and we hid behind a ruined kiosk, watching the scene unfold. In the center of the circle stood a bald man, his body covered in tattoos depicting strange and ominous symbols. He raised his arms, and his deep, sinister voice echoed through the deserted park. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice sounding like an echo from the darkness. "The time has come. The hour of the Great Awakening is upon us. Our god Nocturnus is ready to appear in this world. We, his 12 apostles, are called to perform this ritual and open the gates of darkness." His words cut through the air, sending chills down my spine. The atmosphere thickened, becoming even more menacing. The other participants began to chant, their voices merging into a single dark chorus. Above them, something dreadful began to form, surrounded by dark energy. It slowly rotated, emitting low, muffled sounds like distant moans of lost souls. Time seemed to stand still. Everything around froze in anticipation of something horrific. Victor couldn't hold back. He sprang from cover and began shooting at the robed figures. With the sound of his shots, several cultists fell, their bodies hitting the wet ground. I followed his lead, aiming carefully to stop this nightmare. I noticed that the remaining cultists had vials of some liquid in their hands. They quickly brought them to their lips and drank the contents. Their bodies began to writhe and shake, and I realized something terrible was happening. "Drink, brothers and sisters!" shouted the bald man, his voice full of fanaticism and determination. "Let the darkness fill us with the power of Nocturnus." The cultists drank, and their bodies began to change. Their skin grew fur, their eyes gleamed with malice, and their hands turned into clawed paws. "We must stop them!" yelled Victor, reloading his rifle. Suddenly, the bald man with tattoos lifted his vial and drank its contents. His body immediately began to twist and deform. His skin darkened and became covered with rough scales, and his eyes filled with a devilish light. He roared, and his roar echoed through the park, making the leaves on the trees tremble. In an instant, he turned and disappeared into the night of the park, leading a few of his followers who had also drunk the potion and transformed into monsters. 2 remaining cultists charged at us, their eyes burning with hatred. They rushed at us, growling viciously. Victor and I braced for battle. Victor raised his rifle. The silver bullet's our only hope. The first cultist, transformed into a half-human, half-beast, leapt at me, his claws reaching for my chest. I fired, and the bullet struck his chest, causing him to recoil. He roared in pain, but didn't fall. Victor, meanwhile, took careful aim and fired, his silver bullet hitting the monster in the head, and it collapsed to the ground, silent. The second werewolf, seeing his comrade's death, lunged at Victor. His claws slashed through the air, but Victor dodged at the last moment. I raised my rifle and shot, the bullet tearing through the creature's shoulder, making it retreat. Victor seized the moment and fired again, the bullet hitting the monster's heart. The monster fell, and silence once again surrounded us. "We need to find the others," said Victor, his voice firm. We began to sweep the park, making sure not to miss any hidden spots. The rain continued to pour, the fog grew thicker, and the light from our torches seemed weak and insignificant. The abandoned rides looked even more sinister, their rusty structures emitting creaky sounds reminiscent of groans. We walked past the old carousel pavilion, its paint-peeled horses looking like ghosts of the past. The lights that once illuminated the bustling activity now flickered dimly and uncertainly. The wind howled through the empty Ferris wheel cabins, creating an eerie melody. Suddenly, another werewolf leapt out from behind one of the attractions. It was enormous and covered in fur, its eyes glowing red. It charged at us with incredible speed. Victor fired first, hitting the monster's shoulder but not stopping it. I raised my rifle and shot at the creature's head, but it only slowed down. The cultist lunged at me, and I barely managed to dodge. His claws slashed through the air, his roar deafening. Victor reloaded his rifle and fired again, the bullet piercing the monster's chest, bringing it down. I quickly regained my composure, though it was difficult. We continued our way through the abandoned park, moving forward, surrounded by rain and fog. Silent rides stood around us, each one seeming like a living nightmare. The wind howled through the empty Ferris wheel cabins, its creaky sounds reminiscent of groans. Old kiosks and pavilions looked like abandoned graves, engulfed in darkness and oblivion. We approached one of the creepiest attractions, the Cave of Fear. It was an old pavilion, the entrance adorned with the enormous maw of a monster with sharp teeth. Once children screamed and laughed as they entered to experience thrills. Now it looked like the gates of hell. "We need to check inside," Victor said, his voice tense. We carefully entered. Darkness enveloped us, and only the weak light from our torches pierced the thick gloom. Inside the Cave of Fear was dead silence, broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the wooden planks. The decorations, once meant to frighten visitors, now looked even more terrifying. Artificial cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and figures of monsters and skeletons peered out from the corners, creating the feeling that invisible eyes were watching us. We moved forward, looking around. Suddenly we heard footsteps and heavy breathing. Another cultist jumped out from behind one of the decorations, his body covered in fur, his eyes glowing with malice. He charged at us with the fury of a wild beast. "Look out!" Victor shouted, raising his rifle. The cultist lunged at me, his claws reaching for my chest. I managed to shoot, but the bullet only grazed him. He grabbed my shoulder and I felt sharp pain. Victor shot again, this time hitting the target, and the monster retreated. The werewolf charged at us again, his growl echoing through the attraction. I raised my rifle and shot at the monster's head, but he only slowed down. Victor struck him with the butt of his rifle, knocking him down. I reloaded and fired again. This time the bullet pierced the creature's chest and he fell to the ground. "We need to keep moving," Victor said, breathing heavily. There could be more of them here. We continued our way through the Cave of Fear, each new room seeming even more eerie and sinister. The figures of monsters and skeletons appeared alive, their empty eye sockets following us. We passed through a corridor filled with artificial spiders hanging from the ceiling, their shadows dancing on the walls in the light of our flashlights. Suddenly we heard loud footsteps echoing from the depths of the Cave of Fear. My heart beat faster, and I felt the adrenaline rising again. Victor motioned toward the source of the sound, and we cautiously followed, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps grew louder, and soon we emerged from the cave. Before us lay the abandoned park, dimly lit by streetlights. Ahead we saw the silhouette of their leader, his massive figure standing out against the night sky. We immediately fired at him, but he let out a wild roar and ran toward the Ferris wheel. Suddenly, as if by magic, the wheel came to life. Lights flickered on, and it slowly began to turn. I felt a chill run down my spine. The sight was both eerie and mesmerizing. The creature leapt onto one of the cabins and quickly climbed up the spokes, its dark figure flickering in the light. "Quick! After him!" Victor shouted, pointing to the nearest cabin. We ran to the wheel and jumped into one of the cabins at the last moment. The mechanism kicked in and we started to ascend. I watched as the creature climbed higher, its claws scraping against the metal, making ominous sounds. The wheel slowly turned, and our cabin rose closer to the monster. My hands trembled, but I gripped my weapon tightly, knowing I couldn't let fear take over. The cabin swayed in the wind, and I felt the cold rain dripping on my face. Around us, the lights flickered and the iron creaked, creating an atmosphere of horror and tension. We continued to ascend, and I watched as the creature neared the top of the wheel. Its figure, illuminated by the lights, looked even more menacing. It climbed onto one of the cabins, looking down at us, its eyes glowing red. "Now or never," Victor whispered, taking aim, and he fired. The bullet hit the monster's shoulder, and it roared in pain. I followed suit, my bullet passing through its side, making it stagger. But instead of falling, the creature jumped onto one of the lower spokes and started climbing toward us. The cabin continued to move, and Victor, with a serious expression, turned to me. "We have explosives. We can use them to lure it into the cabin and blow it up." My heart sank at the realization of the danger, but I knew it was our best chance. I nodded, feeling the weight of the task ahead. We set up the explosives in our cabin, checked the detonator, and began firing at the creature. But it seemed the bullets weren't causing critical damage. The wheel had almost completed a full circle, and as our cabin neared the ground, we were ready. The creature raced toward us, its claws scraping against the metal. When the monster burst into the cabin, Victor activated the explosive device. "Now!" Victor shouted, and we jumped out of the cabin. The fall was high, at least 2 stories, and I felt the wind whistle in my ears. I tumbled through the air and landed on the ground, trying to soften the impact. Pain shot through my legs and back, but I knew I had to move. Victor landed nearby, and I saw him get to his feet. At that moment, the cabin with the monster exploded. The deafening blast echoed through the park, illuminating everything with a bright light. Shards of metal flew in all directions, and the creature, trapped in the explosion, let out one last horrifying roar. We were already celebrating victory, breathing heavily and feeling relieved, when suddenly the creature leapt from the burning cabin. It was half burnt, with charred flesh and fiery eyes full of rage. The monster's roar echoed through the park, causing us to freeze in terror for a moment. "Back!" Victor shouted, raising his rifle. The creature charged at us with incredible speed. I managed to shoot, but the bullet only grazed it, not stopping it. The monster swiped at me with its paw, and I was thrown aside, feeling sharp pain in my chest. Victor fired again, aiming for the head, but the creature dodged and lunged at him. I got up, gritting my teeth against the pain, and took aim again. The creature was just a few steps away from Victor. I fired, the bullet hitting the monster's back, making it stagger. Victor took advantage of the moment and struck the creature's head with the butt of his rifle, but it only roared louder, swinging its clawed paws. The creature lunged at me again, and I barely managed to dodge, feeling its claws slice through the air near my face. Victor moved to reload his rifle, and I, summoning all my strength, raised the silver dagger Victor had given me. "Hold on!" I shouted to Victor, charging at the creature. I struck with the dagger, aiming for the monster's chest. The blade sank into its flesh, and the creature howled in pain. It turned and swiped at me with its paw, knocking me down. I rolled and stood up, holding the dagger in front of me. Victor, finally reloading his rifle, shot the monster in the head. The bullet pierced the monster's skull, and it fell to the ground, letting out one last guttural roar. But the creature was still moving, trying to get up. I realized we had to finish it off, or it wouldn't stop. I raised the dagger, and gathering all my resolve, plunged it deep into the monster's heart. The blade cut through the flesh, and the creature convulsed one last time. Silence fell around us. I was breathing heavily, feeling the adrenaline gradually leaving, replaced by exhaustion and pain. Victor approached me, lowering his rifle. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse and tired. "We did it." We stood over the monster's body, breathing heavily and feeling pain in every cell of our bodies. But we knew we had to keep going. Through the pain and exhaustion, we began searching for any remaining monsters that might be hiding in the park's shadows. The rain continued to pour, mixing with our sweat and blood, but we didn't give up. We walked through the old attractions, each step a struggle. The creaky sounds and rustles made our search even more eerie. Around us was dead silence, broken only by the sound of rain and our footsteps. The atmosphere was tense, and every dark corner seemed a potential hiding spot for the remaining creatures. But it seemed they had all fled. We found no traces, no clues. Finally, realizing we needed reinforcement, I called for backup. After a while, help arrived. Police and ambulances came to the park, sirens cutting through the night's silence. When we returned to the battle sites, the bodies of the monsters had transformed back into human forms. Their mutilated and charred remains lay in pools of blood and mud. "What happened here?" one of the officers asked, inspecting the bodies. "It was a battle," I replied, trying to explain everything that had happened. "These people, they turned into monsters. We fought them." Among the bodies were identified known people. They were influential townsfolk, whom no one would have suspected of being linked to a cult. "That's the mayor," one of the officers said, pointing to one of the bodies, "and the head doctor of our hospital." I felt the world around me starting to crumble. These people were respected and trusted members of society, but now they were part of something much darker and more sinister. Victor quickly slipped away, not waiting for the police to arrive. He knew his work here was done, but the hunt continued. I didn't stop him, taking full responsibility myself. Looking at the bodies, I knew our victory was just part of a larger war. The darkness still lurked somewhere in the shadows, and Victor was there to face it head-on. We had to continue our work to prevent such horrors in the future. But I knew that somewhere out there in the night, Victor continued his hunt for these dark creatures, and thanks to him, the world was a bit brighter, even if only for a while.
Story 2.
Outside, the relentless rain poured down. From the gray, gloomy blanket stretching over the roofs of Victorian buildings, The raindrops fell with a heavy, dismal sound. It was chilly and damp on the streets, the wet wind piercing to the bone, a reminder that this was typical English weather. I sat in my office, immersed in the muted light of a kerosene lamp, which barely illuminated the tattered newspaper before me. The headline of the article I was staring at read, "Mystery Murders in Whitechapel Continue." Last night, another young woman's body was found in Whitechapel. Witnesses claim to have seen the shadow of a suspicious man hiding in the fog. The police still have no leads, and the residents of the area are beginning to panic. Who is this mysterious killer? And will they be caught before striking again? Setting the newspaper aside, I pondered as I paced around my office. Why do people kill? This question often arises in my mind. What drives a person to cross the line and become a monster? Envy, greed, anger, all are human vices, but they don't always lead to murder. Perhaps the killer finds some dark satisfaction in the act, a form of power over life and death. Or maybe it's just a manifestation of madness hidden deep within. I walked to the window, gazing thoughtfully at the gray streets where few pedestrians hurried to take shelter from the rain. Memories of my last case surfaced, the grim houses, the trails that led nowhere, and the horror I saw in the victim's eyes. These memories, like shadows, haunted me, giving me no peace day or night. As I continued to wander around the office, I noticed through the curtained window a carriage slowly approaching my house. The dark horses, breathing heavily, stopped, their nostrils steaming in the damp night air. 2 men stepped out of the carriage. One of them, tall and elegantly dressed, clearly belonged to the aristocracy. His walk was measured but showed signs of weariness. The other, shorter and stockier, appeared to be his butler, judging by his strict uniform and confident demeanor. Soon I heard a knock on the door. The dull sounds echoed through the house, interrupting the quiet crackling of the coals in the fireplace. I walked to the door and opened it, letting in the rainy dampness and cold wind. Before me stood the very men I had seen from the window. Lord Charles Blackwood entered the room first. His weary gaze scanned the surroundings of my office. He was tall and gaunt, his face lined with thin wrinkles, evidence of many sleepless nights and experienced worries. There was no hope in his eyes, only deep, hopeless sorrow. He looked as though the weight of the world pressed on his shoulders, and he could no longer find the strength to fight it. His butler followed him. He was of average height, with neatly combed gray hair and attentive eyes. His face expressed restrained concern, as if he was ready to support his master at any moment. "Come in, gentlemen," I said, gesturing them towards the table. Lord Blackwood nodded slightly, his movements slow and a bit uncertain. He sat in the chair opposite me, sighing heavily. The butler remained standing behind, carefully observing his master and the surroundings in the room. My acquaintance with Lord Blackwood began several years ago when I was investigating the case of a missing jeweler. The case was intricate, with every lead ending in a dead end. At some point, I came across his name in the jeweler's client list. Despite his status, the Lord turned out to be a man willing to help justice. He provided information that helped me track down and solve the case. Since then, we had established mutual respect and understanding. "Lord Blackwood," I began, "I assume your visit is related to some urgent matter. How can I help you?" He raised his weary eyes to me, and I felt a wave of his despair and fear wash over him. He began to speak, and from his first words, it was clear that the matter he came with was not just complex, but literally filled with the darkness and horror that had settled in his soul. "Detective Hargrave," he began in a trembling voice, "my daughter, Eleanor, is missing, and I fear that behind this lies something far more sinister than a simple abduction. I've lost all hope of finding her on my own. You are the only one I can trust with this case." I nodded, urging him to continue. "Eleanor disappeared 3 weeks ago," Lord Blackwood continued, his voice slightly trembling. "That evening she was in her room. She said she was tired after the ball and wanted to rest. We left her alone thinking she would just fall asleep. But the next morning she was nowhere to be found. Her room was empty, the windows closed, the door locked from the inside. No one saw her leave, and no one heard anything suspicious. It was as if she had evaporated. I immediately contacted Scotland Yard," he continued. "They searched the entire house, questioned the servants, but found no clues. All the private detectives I hired proved just as helpless. No one could make any progress in the investigation. Then I remembered you, Detective Hargrave, and came straight away." He pulled a folded piece of paper from the inner pocket of his coat and handed it to me. "A few weeks before her disappearance, we started receiving strange letters," the Lord explained. "They contained warnings. Here is one of them. I kept it, read it." I unfolded the letter and read, "Please leave the city as soon as possible. You and your family are in great danger. Do not ignore this warning. Save your daughter and yourself." The words sounded sincere and alarming, as if the author truly cared about the safety of the Blackwood family. I folded the letter and returned it to Lord Charles, deep in thought. This case was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. Someone knew about the impending danger and tried to warn them. Was it an abduction or something darker? "Lord Blackwood," I said decisively, "I will do everything possible to find your daughter and get to the bottom of this dark matter. Let us begin immediately." A faint spark of hope lit up Lord Blackwood's face. "Thank you, Detective. Your help is our last hope," he said with relief. "Please, come with us now." I put on my long dark coat, draping it over my shoulders, then grabbed my hat and put it on, shielding myself from the pouring rain. We descended the creaky stairs, each step echoing in the night silence. Outside, we were met by the cold wind and relentless rain. The horses impatiently shifted from foot to foot, and the carriage awaited us, covered only by a thin roof. We quickly took our places inside. Lord Blackwood sat across from me, and his butler sat next to him, holding a lamp that barely illuminated the dark space of the carriage. London was shrouded in darkness, with only occasional lanterns lighting the streets. The rain beat against the carriage windows, creating a melody that seemed gloomy and endless. We passed through narrow streets and bridges, past houses where lights barely penetrated the curtains. The horses raced forward, their hooves echoing dully on the wet pavement. After passing through several blocks, we found ourselves in a different part of the city. Here the buildings were taller and the streets wider. The carriage stopped in front of a majestic mansion shrouded in darkness and fog. The building towered above us, its facade adorned with marble columns and a massive oak door with metal inlays. The windows, hidden behind heavy curtains, looked like empty eye sockets gazing at us reproachfully. We stepped out of the carriage, and I felt the rain instantly soak through my clothes. Lord Blackwood led us to the door, which his butler opened. We entered the house, and I was immediately enveloped by warmth and coziness, in sharp contrast to the cold, damp weather outside. The mansion's interior was striking in its luxury and sophistication. High ceilings with ornate moldings, massive crystal chandeliers, carved wooden panels on the walls, and a parquet floor gleaming in the light of the lamps created an atmosphere of wealth and grandeur. A light scent of lavender and sandalwood lingered in the air, giving the entire space a subtle touch of comfort and well-being. We ascended a wide staircase, covered with a red carpet that muffled the sound of our footsteps. Portraits of the Blackwood family ancestors hung on the walls, their stern faces and piercing eyes seeming alive, watching our every move. He led me to his daughter's room. We stopped in front of a massive door adorned with intricate carvings. The Lord grasped the handle and opened the door, inviting me to enter. Eleanor's room was spacious and bright, despite the gray day outside. The walls were decorated with floral wallpaper, and the furniture was elegant and refined. In the center stood a large canopy bed adorned with soft pillows and a silk coverlet. By the window was a desk piled with books and papers, next to a cozy chair and a small table with a cup of tea long gone cold. In the corner of the room stood a full-length mirror, and opposite the bed was a dresser with an array of jewelry and perfume bottles. I began my inspection, searching for any clues that might help me understand what had happened. Checking every detail, I noticed the window, firmly closed and locked. The door showed no signs of forced entry. At first glance, everything looked as if Eleanor had simply disappeared without a trace. My eyes settled on a painting hanging above the fireplace. It depicted two men. One was clearly Lord Blackwood in his youth, and the other was slightly younger. "Who is this?" I asked, pointing to the image. Lord Blackwood sighed, his face shadowed by memories. "That is my brother Richard," he replied quietly. "He disappeared many years ago under mysterious circumstances. We never found out what happened to him. Our family has never been the same since." I nodded, contemplating his words. It was a strange coincidence that now Eleanor had disappeared as well. Could Richard somehow be connected to this? I decided that this information might prove important, but kept it at the back of my mind for now. I continued my inspection, checking every corner of the room. My attention was drawn to a small spot on the carpet by the bed. It was barely noticeable and resembled a dried drop of wax from a candle. I thought it might just be a coincidence, a drop that could have fallen while Eleanor was reading by candlelight. Dismissing this detail as insignificant, I continued my search. Lord Blackwood stood by the door, watching my actions with nervous tension. His eyes never left me, as if he was expecting something important to happen at any moment. After examining the entire room, I found no obvious signs of struggle or abduction. But deep down, I knew this case was far more complicated than it seemed at first glance. I turned to Lord Blackwood and said, "Tomorrow, we need to find more witnesses and question the local residents. Perhaps someone noticed something unusual." He nodded in agreement. "Very well, Detective. I will offer you a room for the night. You can stay with us and continue the investigation tomorrow." The next day, I rose early and decided to take a walk around the area. The Blackwood mansion was situated in a district surrounded by shops and stores. However, despite the early hour, there were few people on the streets, and not a single homeless person was in sight. The shops were neat, but seemed lifeless, as if they were afraid to show any activity. I walked, observing the surroundings until I noticed a boy hiding in the shadow of one of the buildings. I beckoned him, and he cautiously approached me. I tossed him a coin, which he immediately rubbed to check its authenticity, then pocketed it. "What do you need, sir?" he asked, his voice quiet and distrustful. "Why are there so few people here?" I asked. The boy glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. "It's because of the mansion," he whispered. "They say there's a monster living there. People are afraid to come close. Folks go missing around it, and that's why everyone stays away." "When does this monster appear?" I inquired. "Around midnight," the boy replied, his eyes widening with fear. "That's when you hear strange sounds and see shadows. Best not to be here at that time." Thanking him, I continued to stroll around the district, contemplating his words. The area seemed even emptier and gloomier after his story. The shop windows looked at me like empty eyes, and the narrow streets seemed to beckon to the unknown. By evening, I returned to the mansion. Finding Lord Charles, I decided to ask him the question that had been troubling me. "Lord Blackwood," I began, "I've heard rumors about monsters living in your mansion. People say that's why folks go missing here and everyone is afraid to come close." He sighed wearily and shook his head. "Those are just tales and superstitions, Detective. There are no monsters here. It's just rumors spread by the locals. I'm sure it has nothing to do with Eleanor's disappearance." It seemed to me that Lord Blackwood lived in his own world, detached from reality, as if the world around him didn't matter. His tired eyes, filled with hopelessness, did not inspire confidence. I decided to wander the estate and talk to the servants to gather more information. The servants were also frightened. I noticed how they avoided meeting my gaze, hurried away, and whispered among themselves. I approached one of the maids I spotted near the kitchen door. "Excuse me," I said, trying to start a conversation. "Could you tell me what's happening here? Have you seen anything unusual?" She looked at me, her eyes full of fear. She replied reluctantly, barely audible. "I'm not allowed to talk about it," she whispered. "We've been forbidden." At that moment, the butler appeared in the kitchen doorway. The maid fell silent and, casting me one last glance, hurried away. This was strange, and I felt there was something important being hidden here. After dinner, I decided to go out on a nighttime patrol to find out what monster was terrorizing the neighborhood. I put on my coat and hat and quietly slipped outside. The night in London was shrouded in fog, and the rain continued to drizzle, creating a melody of drops hitting the pavement. I walked down the street, looking around, then decided to enter the mansion's grounds and explore the garden. The garden was large and maze-like, with winding paths and tall bushes. The atmosphere became eerie as soon as I ventured deeper into the garden. An ominous silence reigned, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. A sense of unease began to envelop me, sending shivers down my spine. It felt like the darkness was thickening, and every bush and tree hid something dangerous. Suddenly I heard strange sounds. They came from the depths of the garden, quiet, almost inaudible footsteps and rustling. I stopped, listening, my heart beating faster. Fear gripped my throat, but I continued walking toward the source of the noise, understanding that this could be the key to solving the mystery. The shadows of the trees seemed alive, reaching out to me as if trying to grab hold. I looked around, feeling fear slowly squeezing me in its icy embrace. But I knew I had to keep going. Step by step, I approached the source of the sounds until I saw a silhouette. A dark figure stood nearby, almost blending in with the surrounding darkness. As soon as it realized it had been spotted, it started running. I gave chase, feeling adrenaline rush through my veins. The pursuit was intense. I pushed through bushes, jumped over tree roots, trying not to lose sight of the figure. The fog and darkness made the chase even more challenging and sinister. The figure flitted before me like a ghost, but I wasn't about to give up. We burst onto the street, where the weak light of gas lamps struggled to penetrate the fog. Our footsteps echoed through the empty streets, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The figure turned down one alley and then another, trying to throw me off. I strained every muscle to keep up, feeling adrenaline pump through my veins. My heart pounded. My breathing became fast and shallow, but I couldn't afford to stop. The fog grew thicker, impairing visibility, but I kept pursuing my target. Finally, I caught up with him. The young man stumbled and fell to the ground, looking at me with desperation. His face was marred by numerous scars, giving him a grotesque appearance. He looked around frantically, clearly searching for an escape route. He was dressed in simple gray clothes, like he had escaped from a poorhouse. Worn-out trousers, a shirt greasy from long wear, and a torn jacket. The number 31 was embroidered on the back of his shirt. "Stop!" I shouted, pulling out my revolver and aiming it at him. "Don't move!" At that moment, the fog rolled in from nowhere, quickly and unnaturally filling the alley. Visibility instantly decreased, and I felt fear grip me again in its icy embrace. The fog was dense, thick, and it seemed to breathe and move like a living thing. Something moved within the fog, the shadows becoming more sinister and alive. I tensed, trying to discern what was happening. Suddenly I heard a scream, piercing and full of terror. The fog began to clear, revealing a horrifying sight. The young man's body lay on the ground, his face twisted in a final scream of pain. I approached and saw that he had been strangled. The marks of hands squeezing his throat were clearly visible. People began to gather in the alley, drawn by the noise. I raised my hand to stop them. "Call the constables," I said firmly. "A murder has occurred here." Within minutes, the constables arrived, and I explained what had happened. We thoroughly examined the crime scene, trying not to miss any details. The constables took my statement, as well as the statements of those who had arrived first. The body was covered and prepared for transport to the morgue. Thoughts swarmed in my head like flies around a light. Who could have killed him so cruelly right before my eyes? Why was he so disfigured? And why did the fog appear so suddenly and unnaturally? Had he escaped from somewhere? These questions tormented me, and I felt that this case was becoming more complex and dangerous. Returning to the mansion, I went to Lord Charles, who met me in the drawing room. I told him what had happened, describing the chase, the sudden fog, and the brutal murder. "Lord Blackwood," I concluded, "this murder happened right before my eyes. It cannot be a mere coincidence." I noticed that the butler, James, standing beside the Lord, was acting somewhat strangely. His eyes darted nervously, and his face showed hidden concern. He was clearly hiding something or knew more than he let on. The next day, I decided to inspect the grounds around the mansion again. The morning was cold and bleak. The fog still hung in the air, giving everything around a sinister tint. Passing by the gates, I noticed an old woman standing before the mansion. Her face was marked by sorrow, and her eyes looked into the distance as if searching for something. I approached her and asked, "Excuse me, madam, can I help you with something?" She turned to me, and I saw deep sadness and weariness in her eyes. "I'm looking for my son," she said quietly. "His name is Thomas. He disappeared 4 weeks ago. I'm afraid something happened to him." "What exactly happened?" I asked, trying to speak as gently as possible. "My son and the Lord's daughter fell in love with each other," she began, her voice trembling. "But the Lord was against their relationship. Thomas was a commoner, and the Lord didn't want his daughter to be involved with someone like him. One night, Thomas disappeared. I searched for him everywhere but found no trace. Do you think Lord Blackwood could be involved in his disappearance?" I asked, trying to understand the depth of her despair. "I don't know," she replied, her eyes filling with tears. "But ever since Thomas disappeared, I feel that something is wrong. People say strange things happen here, that someone or something lives in this mansion and brings misfortune." This woman's story added another puzzle to my investigation. Thomas, a commoner, and Eleanor, the Lord's daughter, had fallen in love but were separated. Now both had disappeared, and the clues led to the very heart of this dark mansion. I felt that uncovering this mystery might help me understand what was truly happening here and who or what was behind these disappearances. I decided to head to the market, hoping to find a couple of street urchins who could help me with surveillance. The market was a lively place where the voices of vendors and buyers mingled. The smells of fresh produce and spices filled the air. Walking past the stalls, I noticed two boys who were clearly looking for a way to earn their keep. I approached them and quietly said, "Boys, I need your help. I'll pay you for a job." They looked at me with distrust, their eyes expressing fear and caution. "What do you need?" one of them asked, slightly older than the other. "I need you to watch the butler from the Blackwood mansion if he leaves the house," I replied. "I'll pay you for it." They exchanged glances, and the younger boy shook his head. "We've heard about the monster," he whispered. "No one wants to go there." I understood that the rumors of the monster scared them, so I pulled a few coins from my pocket and handed them to the boys. "I'll give you more," I said. "Just watch and report back if you see anything suspicious." Greed overcame their fear, and they agreed. "All right, mister. We'll do it." After that, I spent the day searching for clues, questioning the local residents and trying to find any thread that might lead to a breakthrough. But it was all in vain. No new leads. Returning to the mansion in the evening, I had dinner and decided to inspect Eleanor's room once more. Taking a lamp, I headed upstairs. The room greeted me with the same eerie silence. The lamp's light cast long shadows that danced on the walls, giving the place an even more sinister look. I came across the wax stain on the carpet that had caught my attention the first time. This time, I decided to move the carpet and inspect the floor beneath it. With difficulty, I shifted the heavy carpet and discovered a barely noticeable seam in the floor. "There's something here," I whispered to myself. Using a knife, I carefully pried at the seam, trying not to damage the wood. Finally, after several minutes of effort, the board gave way, revealing a hidden door. It opened to a narrow passage leading down into the darkness. The lamp's light penetrated the narrow passage, illuminating old stone steps descending into the gloom. The passage was cramped and damp, the walls covered in moss and mold. I felt my heart beat faster, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Fear and curiosity mixed within me, pushing me forward. I slowly descended the steps, holding the lamp before me. Each step echoed dully, as if the place was coming to life beneath my feet. The air was stale and cold, the smell of dampness filling my nostrils, heightening the sense of anxiety. The passage led to a narrow corridor, its walls covered in cobwebs. I walked slowly, listening to every sound, trying not to miss a single detail. The feeling that I was on the brink of discovering something important did not leave me. Suddenly, I heard a rustling ahead, and a chill ran down my spine. I froze, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it was quiet all around. I continued moving forward, feeling fear gradually give way to determination. I needed to find out what this passage concealed and learn what really happened to Eleanor and Thomas. The passage led me lower and lower, and soon I found myself in a spacious room. Using the lamp, I illuminated the space and realized that it was likely a basement. The walls were made of rough stones, and the ceiling was low, supported in places by wooden beams that creaked under the weight of time. In the corner of the room stood an old, slightly rusted bed with a thin mattress and a tattered blanket. Next to the bed was a small wooden table, covered with books on chemistry and physics. Their worn covers and yellowed pages indicated frequent use. On the shelf above the table stood more books, including works by Jules Verne. An old worn carpet, stained and frayed, lay on the floor. Against the wall stood a wardrobe with simple but neatly arranged clothes. Beside it was an old chest, covered in dust, as if it hadn't been opened in a long time. Childish drawings hung on the walls. One depicted a house with tall windows and large doors. Another showed strange creatures and fantastic worlds. It seemed that someone had tried to escape reality into a world of imagination and dreams. Carefully examining the room, I suddenly noticed tracks on the floor that alarmed me. They were deep scratches, as if made by the claws of a large animal. They clearly didn't belong to a dog. The tracks were much larger and deeper, as if someone with great force had clawed the stone floor. A sense of unease gripped me. I continued my inspection and discovered a couple more narrow passages in the walls, leading into the darkness. Suddenly, from one of them came a noise, accompanied by a low growl. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and my heart began to race faster. Fear gripped me, and I realized that something was approaching. Without thinking long, I jumped into one of the passages. I crawled through the narrow corridor, holding the lamp before me. The space was so tight that I could barely move. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps and a piercing growl behind me. Something big and menacing was pursuing me. Adrenaline surged through my veins, fear driving me forward. The corridor suddenly widened, and I found myself in the city's sewer system. The air was filled with a musty smell, the walls covered in slime and mold. I realized I needed to hurry if I wanted to survive. I ran, glancing back, and saw a huge creature, resembling a wolf, emerging from the passage. A lycanthrope, the thought flashed through my mind. The creature was enormous, its furry body a mass of muscles and rage. Its eyes glowed with a fierce fire, and its fangs gleamed in the light of my lamp. I felt a chill run down my spine, and fear gripped me in its icy embrace again. "Damn!" I exclaimed. The creature lunged at me. I drew my revolver and began firing, aiming for its head and chest. The bullets hit their mark, but seemed to do little harm. The sound of gunshots echoed through the sewer tunnels, but it didn't stop the beast. Ahead, I saw a ladder. It was an exit. Struggling to overcome my fear, I sprinted toward it, feeling the creature closing in. My heart pounded, my lungs burned from lack of air, but I couldn't stop. Reaching the ladder leading upwards, I began to climb quickly. The ladder was slippery and rusty, but I clung to every rung, trying not to slip. Reaching the top, I pushed open the hatch and emerged onto the surface. The night had already fallen on the city, and I found myself on an empty street, dimly lit by gas lamps. The creature dared not pursue me further. Looking around, I realized I was in the market district. I breathed heavily, feeling the adrenaline gradually leave my body, giving way to fatigue and relief. I could hardly believe what had happened. The rumors of a monster, which I had found ridiculous, suddenly turned into a terrifying reality. The lycanthrope that had pursued me in the sewer was too real, and this fact cast a new shadow on the events. Returning to the mansion, I decided not to tell the Lord about what had happened. My story of a monster would likely provoke only doubt and mistrust. The next day, the two boys I had hired to follow the butler came to see me. They looked excited and a little scared. "Mister, we saw something," one of them said, glancing around nervously. The butler went to a suspicious place. "Where exactly?" I asked, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. "To the old abandoned factory that belongs to Lord Blackwood. It's near the mansion." "Here it is," I muttered, realizing that this information could be the key to solving the mystery. "All right, thank you." Here's your reward." I gave them the money and headed back to the mansion, pondering how to share this information with the Lord. Finding a moment when we were alone, I told him everything in detail. The Lord was shocked and couldn't believe that his trusted man could betray him. "James? But he's been with our family for many years. It's impossible," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Nevertheless, I suggest we follow him," I insisted. "This might help us understand what's going on." In the evening, we decided to act. When night fell and the mansion was plunged into silence, we saw James quietly leave the house. We followed him, trying to remain unnoticed. He walked confidently, avoiding well-lit streets and choosing the darkest and narrowest alleys. We followed him at a safe distance, trying not to make any noise. The fog once again enveloped the city, giving everything a sinister tone. Finally, James reached the old abandoned factory. The building loomed before us, dark and half-ruined. Its windows were broken, and the walls covered in moss and graffiti. The butler looked around before entering. "We must be careful," I whispered to Lord Blackwood, who looked visibly shaken. We quietly followed him, trying not to give away our presence. Inside the factory, there was silence, broken only by our cautious steps. The air was filled with the smell of dampness and decay. We walked down a long corridor until we heard muffled voices. Stopping at a corner, we cautiously peeked around and saw James talking to someone. Their faces were hidden in shadows, but it was clear they were discussing something important. We waited until the butler and his companion parted ways. James went in one direction, and the suspicious man headed further into the factory. We quietly followed the man, trying not to reveal our presence. The factory was dark and abandoned, the walls covered in moss and rust, and the air was filled with a musty smell. The man descended a creaky staircase into the basement, and we carefully followed him. Reaching the bottom, we found ourselves in a narrow corridor dimly lit by lamps. We walked down it, and as we progressed, doors to various rooms opened before us. In some of these rooms, people were chained. Old men, women, and children. They all looked emaciated and exhausted, devoid of strength. Their faces expressed hopelessness and fear. They were dressed in the same simple gray clothing as the young man I had seen dead in the fog. "My God," whispered Lord Blackwood, his voice full of horror and despair. I readied my revolver, staying on alert. We continued down the corridor, trying not to attract attention. Ahead, we saw an entrance to a large room resembling a laboratory. It was filled with various tools and equipment, among which large glass capsules stood out, filled with liquid. Inside these capsules floated monsters, similar to the one I had seen earlier. They were lycanthropes. Their huge, furry bodies, sharp claws, and menacing eyes looked terrifying. 2 men worked in the laboratory. One was dressed in work clothes, dirty and worn, with tools hanging from his belt. The other wore a robe and a bird-like mask resembling a raven. The mask completely covered his face, giving him a sinister appearance. I raised my revolver and commanded, "Raise your hands." They turned, their eyes widening in surprise. The worker, trembling, raised his hands, but the man in the mask remained calm. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my revolver ready. "We are those who serve the cause of science," replied the man in the mask. His voice was deep and cold. I approached the man, ready for anything. Tearing off his mask, I heard Lord Blackwood gasp in surprise. "Richard? You're alive? How can this be? I thought you had disappeared." The man, Lord Blackwood's brother, smirked and spoke in a cold voice. "Of course, I made everyone think I was dead. I knew you wouldn't leave me alone and let me conduct my research." "But why? Why did you do this?" Lord Blackwood asked in despair. "You're a fool, Charles," Our family has studied science and human enhancement for generations, but you decided to discard all that, considering it foolishness. I was loyal to our ancestors and continued the research, which was grand. We sought ways to improve human nature, to create superhumans. Lycanthropy turned out to be the perfect solution, a fusion of man and beast to achieve unparalleled strength and endurance. But you weren't interested in that, and you renounced our family's legacy. So I left, faking my death, to continue our ancestors' work without your interference. And what about Eleanor? What did you do to her? I asked, trying to stay calm. I needed material that was best suited for transformation, Richard answered coldly. And it had to be someone from our lineage, so I had to take her. Lord Blackwood collapsed to the ground, lamenting. No, my daughter. My daughter. She made a good subject. Too bad she escaped, Richard said with a slight smirk. But we can't complete our research without her. So excuse me. Thomas, come out. A monster emerged from a nearby room. He was taller than a human, covered in stitched patches and embedded with various devices. He looked like Frankenstein's creature, but with more mechanized and sinister details. His body had metal plates and tubes connecting different parts. Smoke started to emerge from one of the tubes, filling the room. That's the guy his mother was looking for, I realized. He's the culprit behind that murder. The monster slowly approached us. I started shooting at him, but the bullets only bounced off the metallic parts of his body. He continued to advance, and more smoke began to pour out of another tube, filling the room with a poisonous cloud. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Lord Blackwood's hand. We ran down the corridor, trying to get away from the monster. He began to catch up with us, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. We burst outside, where the night air was fresh and cold. Suddenly, a werewolf jumped out of the shadows and attacked Thomas. It was so unexpected that we turned around abruptly, watching them with open mouths. They engaged in a brutal fight. The werewolf, covered in thick fur and with enormous fangs, clawed and bit into the monster's body. The monster, despite his mechanical parts, fought with incredible strength. He struck the werewolf with his metallic arms, tearing chunks of flesh and blood. The werewolf growled, fiercely resisting, and delivered several powerful blows to the monster's face and chest. The monster seemed invulnerable. His mechanical parts protected him from most of the blows, and the smoke from the tubes created a barrier that the werewolf struggled to break through. However, the werewolf did not give up, and his rage only intensified. The battle lasted for several minutes, but it felt like hours. Eventually, the monster stepped back, and at that moment Thomas, as if coming to his senses, stopped for a moment. His eyes met the werewolf's, and he cried out plaintively, "Eleanor!" The werewolf, pausing for a moment, looked at Thomas. Then it roared and continued the attack. Realizing the horror of what was happening, Thomas grabbed an iron pipe lying nearby, and with incredible strength plunged it into the werewolf. The werewolf howled in pain, and its body began to change. The fur started to disappear, the claws and fangs retracted, and before us appeared a young woman, Eleanor. She, exhausted and wounded, lay on the ground, her face pale but expressing relief. Thomas, with despair and pain in his eyes, looked at her. "Forgive me, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice trembling with grief. "I couldn't leave you like this." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She tried to say something, but her strength was leaving her. Understanding that her suffering must end, Thomas tightened his grip on the iron pipe and drove it deeper into Eleanor's heart. She closed her eyes forever, her face frozen in peace. "No, my daughter," whispered Lord Blackwood, his voice shaking with grief. I bowed my head, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Thomas turned and ran back to the laboratory. I stood there, unsure of what to do, but then decided and followed him. When I reached the laboratory, I was met with a horrifying scene. Thomas was holding the bodies of 2 strangled people. Goosebumps ran down my spine. Thomas turned and said, "Get the people out. You don't have much time. Everything will explode soon." I looked around and noticed a device in the corner, quietly ticking. Realizing the danger, I swore and ran back. On the wall, I saw a bunch of keys hanging on a hook. Grabbing them, I started freeing the prisoners from their cells. They were emaciated and terrified, but they understood this was their only chance for salvation. "Faster! Faster!" I shouted, freeing one after another. We ran outside, and I grabbed Lord Blackwood's hand, dragging him away from the factory. He was in shock and barely moved his legs, but I couldn't let him stay there. As we got to a safe distance, a deafening explosion rang out. The factory blew up, and a fireball rose into the sky. The blast wave knocked us down. I covered my head with my hands, trying to protect myself from the debris. When it was over, I lifted my head and saw the destroyed factory. The fire still raged, but the main danger had passed. Lord Blackwood sat on the ground, his face streaked with tears. "No, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice shaking with grief. I turned and saw the freed prisoners. They were shocked and exhausted, but alive. We had done everything we could. After the explosion, we slowly regained our senses. Lord Blackwood sat on the ground, tears streaming down his cheeks, his grief indescribable. I approached him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "We need to go, Lord Blackwood. There's nothing more we can do here." The freed prisoners also began to recover. Their eyes expressed a mix of horror, exhaustion, and hope. I approached them and said, "We need to find a safe place. Follow me." We headed to the nearest police station, where I explained the situation. The constables received us with surprise and concern, but soon began to act, helping the freed prisoners and providing them with first aid. Lord Blackwood was in a state of deep shock, and I knew it would take time for him to recover from this tragedy. His daughter was dead. His brother turned out to be a monster. But despite all this, he found the strength to express his gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "Without you, it would have been much worse." "I did what I had to," I replied, "but I'm sorry for your loss." The days following the explosion were filled with investigations and interrogations. The police began to clear the rubble of the factory, gathering evidence and trying to understand the full extent of the mad experiments Richard had conducted. The secrets surrounding the Blackwood mansion gradually began to unfold. I also found time to meet with Thomas's mother. Her heart was broken, but she was grateful that the truth had finally come out. "Thank you, Detective," she said with tears in her eyes. "My boy can now rest in peace." Finally, I returned to my office. Outside, the rain was pouring again, typical English weather. I sat at my desk, reading the newspaper and reflecting on everything that had happened. The headlines were full of news about the exposure of horrific crimes and the heroic rescue of the prisoners. Setting the newspaper aside, I wandered thoughtfully around my office. My thoughts returned to the philosophical question: why do people kill? What drives them to cross the line and become monsters? Envy, greed, anger. All these are human vices, but sometimes there is something more, dark and unexplored behind them.
Story 3.
It hadn't been the best day for Ulrich from Neheim. The large deer he had been tracking since morning stubbornly eluded the old hunter. Several times he got close enough to shoot, but at the last moment, the cautious animal would disappear among the yellowing leaves. Cursing everything under the sun, Ulrich had considered giving up and heading home empty-handed. But the silhouette of the deer with its large antlers, flickering among the trees, rekindled his hope. Consumed by the thrill of the hunt, the old man failed to notice how the shadows grew longer and stars began to light up the darkening sky. Only when the moon rose, silvering the forest-covered hills, did Ulrich realize he had strayed too far from home. The cursed deer was still somewhere nearby. Ulrich even saw its antlers flicker among the branches a couple of times, but continuing the chase was impossible. It was too late to head home, so the hunter decided to spend the night in the forest and resume the hunt in the morning. He doubted the deer would go far overnight. Fortunately, Ulrich knew of a cozy cave in the nearby foothills where he had taken shelter from bad weather before. He needed to hurry. Cold mist was already descending from the mountains, creeping like a pale ghost among the forested hills. Gathering some kindling along the way, Ulrich reached the cave, a water-worn hollow between the rocks, where he lit a fire. Pulling a piece of dried meat from the bag slung over his shoulder, he hungrily sank his teeth into it. After washing down the modest meal with spring water, Ulrich was about to stamp out the fire and sleep on the stones warmed by the flames when something strange caught his eye in the flickering firelight. The flames danced and fluttered as if about to extinguish, something that had never happened before. Ulrich moved closer, shielding the fire, and felt a wave of cold air against his back. The hunter turned around. Had it seemed, or had the far wall receded into darkness since his last visit? Grabbing a burning branch from the fire, the hunter ventured deeper into the cave. A few disturbed bats took off from the wall, heading towards a large crack that had opened in the far wall. Ulrich frowned as he approached. It had been a long time since he was last here, but he remembered there being nothing like this before. He raised the makeshift torch higher, carefully examining the cold-breathing fissure. Something glinted faintly on the stones. Ulrich bent down and picked up a silver coin with Spanish inscriptions, a full-weight New Navarrese peso. There were traces of candle wax and soot on the stones, and in the wet dirt of droppings and rain-washed dust was the print of a boot. Ulrich's head spun, and he leaned against the wall. These mountains were riddled with hidden paths used by smugglers who had long favored this borderland and often stashed their goods in local caves. A reward from Baron Manfred was due for pointing out such a lair, but there could be something to gain for himself. Besides, whoever had set up this hideout seemed to be absent now. Otherwise, they would have made their presence known by now. Carefully blowing on the dying flame, the hunter stepped inside. Darkness closed around him like a womb, the flickering firelight illuminating only the damp walls. Afraid of getting lost, Ulrich thought of turning back when the crack ended, and he found himself in a large cave among stalagmites and stalactites, merging into giant columns. Water gurgled somewhere below, and the squeaking of bats echoed from the stone vaults. Ulrich, of course, knew of the legendary Giant's Cave and realized he had stumbled upon some southeastern offshoot. Probably, underground waters had washed out the crack in the rock, connecting local lands with the famous subterranean labyrinths. The hunter raised his torch higher and froze, turning into one of the stone pillars himself. Right in front of him stood a huge stalagmite, towering above the rest like a mighty oak among young saplings. The sharp needle-like peak was crowned with a mutilated human body, like a beetle skewered by a shrike on an acacia thorn. The glassy brown eyes stared lifelessly at the hunter, frozen in horror. A strange rustling sound came from behind, followed by a nauseating stench hitting his nostrils. Shaking off his paralysis, Ulrich turned, tearing his double-barreled gun from his shoulder, but something struck him in the chest, sending waves of unbearable, excruciating pain through his body. Ulrich opened his mouth to scream, but only a gurgling gasp escaped his lips, now white with blood. From the corner of his eye he caught a glimpse of a white shadow with grotesque, misshapen outlines, and a huge eye with a vertical pupil flashed with a horrifying fire. Then a new pain, even more intense than the last, pierced Ulrich, and darkness swallowed him whole. A tall, blond man in an unremarkable black cloak stood on a rocky cliff, surveying the small valley below, overgrown with dense forest. Wisps of gray mist slowly descended from the hilltops, and a light rain fell from the sky. In the distance, the mournful howl of a wolf echoed. There was something melancholy and subtly frightening about this place, pressing with an inexplicable weight on anyone who found themselves here at this time of year. However, there was not a trace of anxiety on the traveler's narrow face. His cold gray eyes matched the gloomy sky. He knew this land well. The forested plateau carved by ravines and gorges, dotted with numerous lakes, rivers, and waterfalls. The superstitious settlers on both sides of the border populated these forests and caves with monsters. Forest spirits fond of human women, werewolves, dwarves guarding treasures at the bottom of caves, and other creatures born from the age-old imagination of common folk. Not all of these tales were idle gossip, but Willam van Hine, a soldier of fortune from the Lake Country, was more concerned with earthly dangers, the kind that could be shot with the 2 multi-shot revolvers hanging from his belt, the pride of the Friesland Confederation's gun factories. Wolves, panthers, and bears roamed these forests, and poisonous snakes were not uncommon. Bandit gangs, smugglers, and runaway slaves from the Euskadi plantations also hid here. Local barons' patrols hunted them down, sometimes treating travelers no better than bandits themselves. On the other side of the border, the viceroy's soldiers of the mountain provinces of Euskadi behaved similarly, often crossing into neighboring territory. This is why the traveler scrutinized the distance closely. Was there smoke or any other sign of human presence? Satisfied that the surroundings were deserted, the Frisian began his descent. The slanting rain grew heavier as Willam entered the dense thicket. The ground was wet, and little streams gurgled here and there. Thick moss and the roots and ivy hanging from the slopes gave the valley a certain charm, though it was almost lost in the dreary, dull gloom. Willam spotted the deer around a bend in a small animal trail. The animal's carcass hung among the broken branches of a mighty larch tree, immediately catching the eye. Turning into all ears and constantly looking around, the Frisian approached the tree, noting that the deer was suspended at least 6 feet above the ground. Pushing aside the branches, Willam raised his eyebrows in surprise. He had seen people torn apart by predators, but no beast inflicted such wounds. It was as if huge jaws had chewed the body while a large bird pecked at it. The skull was split open with a single blow, and the brain neatly eaten out. A terrible wound gaped in the abdomen. The invisible predator had tried to reach the liver and heart. The rest of the body was covered in numerous round wounds or bites. And strangest of all, there was very little blood on the body. Neither bear nor panther could do this to a deer, not to mention that it would be difficult for them to haul an adult deer to such a height. The Frisian cautiously touched the torn flesh, rubbed a lump of clotted blood between his fingers, and brought it to his nose. The animal had been lying here for at least a day, but who knows if the unknown predator was resting in the bushes after a hearty meal. And wouldn't it want to resume its feast soon? What kind of creature could have done this? Willam couldn't fathom. His gaze accidentally caught the wet moss covering the ground under the tree. A chill ran down his spine as he remembered other legends of the local inhabitants. A large hoofprint was clearly visible on the green carpet. The best thing Willam could do now was to reach the nearest settlement as quickly as possible. Casting one last wary glance around, the mercenary moved away. It was already getting dark when Willem van Hyn reached the outskirts of Neheim, the southernmost town in the Valberg Confederation. Once a bustling trading crossroads, it was now rapidly falling into decay after the revolution overthrew the kingdom of New Navarre and established the Republic of Euskadi in its place. Essentially, little had changed. Even the president was a relative of the deposed king. But the Confederation barons, frightened by the imperial revolution in the Old World, refused to have any dealings with Euskadi. This hit several border towns hard, including Neheim, which was quickly turning into a large village. However, Willam was in no position to be picky. He decided not to enter the town itself. Citizens of the Friesland Confederation were still not welcome in these parts. The descendants of the brother knights of the Order of St. Walpurga Teutonic still held a grudge for the loss of the coast even 300 years later. And although the Confederation and Friesland now shared common enemies, the attitude towards Frisians in the Valberg hinterlands left much to be desired. Fortunately, Willam knew of a suitable place on the outskirts, the Red Wolf Inn. It stood on the road that had once been the main trading route, and here they were not yet unaccustomed to various travelers. The stuffed animal that gave the inn its name bared its teeth under a small awning, beneath which stood several horses, 3 or 4 peasant nags and a bay stallion, judging by its build, a purebred Floridian, a descendant of the Arabian horses brought 3 centuries ago. Willam raised an eyebrow in surprise. It was rare to see such a horse in these parts. I should have a word with its owner, thought the Frisian, climbing the steps of the inn and pushing the heavy door open. Inside was a large hall filled with tables that could seat 5 or 6 people each. The place had clearly seen better days. Currently, there were only 6 people in the entire inn. At one table sat a pair of peasants, slurping hearty meat stew and washing it down with local beer. At the next table, a burly man with a puffy face and a thick light beard was working his way through a rabbit stew. Across from him, a thin priest in a black cassock sipped wine absently. With the order dissolved, many barons had switched from Catholicism to Martinianism, but here in the remote provinces, they still remained loyal to the Holy See. Another guest, a red-haired giant, sat alone at a table in the corner by a lit fireplace. He wore leather trousers, a thick shirt, and a cloak clearly not of local make, adorned with patterned woolen trim. A large beer mug sat in front of him as he gnawed on a large ham bone. He looked decidedly out of place, and Willam realized he had found the owner of the Floridian. The 6th was a stocky man with a huge belly and muscular arms, standing at the bar. His bald head was ringed with curly blonde hair, and his small eyes lit up with interest at the sight of the Frisian. "Willam!" he boomed. "Damn it. Oh, excuse me, father," he added, turning to the priest. The latter nodded solemnly, casting a keen glance at Willam. "I'm glad to see you too, Kurt," Willam grinned, seating himself at the nearest table. "What do you have for me? Any good venison?" "Alas," Kurt shrugged. "Old Ulrich the hunter promised me a deer yesterday, but he vanished in the forest. But we have an excellent ham." "Bring it on," Willam nodded. "And some goat cheese, bread, and a pitcher of beer. No, make it a jug." Kurt nodded and disappeared through a side door. Willam sat by the fireplace and surveyed the tavern. The others paid him little mind, except for the red-haired giant in the corner. At the first sound of Willam's voice, He had turned and was now staring at the Frisian with squinted green eyes. Noticing Willam's attention, the guest smirked crookedly and made an inviting gesture. Willam shook his head, indicating the door where Kurt had disappeared, and the red-haired man, shrugging, returned to his interrupted dinner. Willam noted the bulge of a weapon under the man's cloak. It wasn't wise to travel these parts unarmed. The door clattered and a tray of food landed on Willam's table. Kurt followed with a jug of beer. "Honestly, I never expected to see you alive," Kurt said, seating himself across from Willam. "You were heading to Doria 3 years ago." "Doria," Willam scoffed bitterly. "There is no more Doria, Kurt. There's California, damned by the almighty California, and may it rot in hell. Though hell has already broken loose there. Black Amazons beating drums in the squares of New Liguria, drunken hymns to bloodthirsty gods resounding in the Doge's palace, and voodoo shamans divining by human entrails on cathedral altars." "I heard about that," Kurt shuddered. "Damn it. Since the Empire's fall, the world seems to have gone mad. I didn't think you'd come back from there." Neither did I. Scenes that still haunted Willam in his nightmares flashed before his eyes. Black smoke over palace roofs and cathedrals, the blood-red river teeming with gorged alligators, the frenzied flight through deadly swamps, the rhythmic beat of drums, and the impassive faces of his former comrades trailing behind. The faces of those who died fighting off the howling black devils. But he wouldn't share this with Kurt. Now it seemed unreal even to him. Willam shook his head to dispel the grim memories. "California is hell," he repeated, "and it is ruled by the devil, or rather, a deviless in human form, with the body of Venus, but a heart blacker than her skin." "The Empress?" "Yes, Lucretia. Doge Vincenzo was a fool not to strangle his maid before she gave birth to that monster. He drained his mug in one gulp and bit into the juicy meat, trying to drown out the distressing memories with food and drink. I went to New Navarre," he continued after satiating his initial hunger. "But trouble started there too when the locals decided they were Basques, not Navarrese. I had no desire to fight for Prince Gonzalo, and then rumors of an impending war in the north reached me. So I headed home." "I went outside," Kurt remarked, "but I didn't see a new horse under the awning. Did you walk through the mountains?" "Not exactly," Willam replied with his mouth full of bread and cheese. "My horse managed to step on a snake in the mountains when I was less than a day's journey from Neheim." "Thank God you made it by nightfall," Kurt said with feeling. "Your guardian angel must be getting double pay in the heavenly office. I wouldn't wish anyone to be left in the mountains, especially on this night. Not even a Frisian," he added. "Afraid old Richard will pay your inn a visit?" Willam smirked. "I bet he won't be as easygoing as I am." "It's not funny, Van Hine." Kurt shook his head. "You're an outsider and don't know these parts. It's no place for a Christian, even if he's just a Martinian and not a good Catholic, to be under the open sky on the night of the wild hunt of Magister Zalza." Among the many local legends and beliefs, some dating back to the time of the Oceanic Crusade, one of the most terrifying tales was the legend of Richard von Zalza, the third magister of the Walpurgis order. Deposed by his jealous rivals and insulted in his deepest feelings, the magister cursed God and devoted himself to the service of Satan. It was said he had allied with the original inhabitants of these lands, against whom the order had been founded. Fires burned on the hill slopes, and von Zalza, with his loyal knights, offered human sacrifices to long-forgotten gods. No one knew how he died. Rumor had it that the devil himself came to claim his soul at the appointed hour. But the peasants whispered that on a certain night in autumn, the gates of hell would open, and Richard von Zalza would lead the wild hunt. It was believed that on this night, all the evil spirits came out, and witches' spells were especially powerful. "Satan's spawn have already crawled out of hell, I swear by St. Michael," the innkeeper grumbled. "Yesterday, 2 boys went squirrel hunting. They never returned. Old Ulrich is missing too, and if anyone knows this forest like the back of his hand, it's him." "Think the Magister got them?" Willam feigned a smile, though unease crept into his mind as he recalled the deer killed by some unknown beast. "Maybe him, maybe one of his pack," Kurt shrugged. "Who can tell with the devil's children? But I'll tell you this, Frisian." Willam glanced over his shoulder and Kurt almost whispered, "It wasn't a good hour when that red-haired bastard showed up here." "What's wrong with him?" Willam asked. "Not him, but what he brought," Kurt shuddered. "In all my years at the Red Wolf, I've never seen such filth. If he hadn't paid in gold for 3 days in advance, though he's only staying 1 night, I'd never have let him through the door. And now I pray hourly for the Lord not to punish me for my greed." "What did he bring to your place?" Willam asked, intrigued despite himself. "Not what, but whom?" Kurt replied, standing up. "Go ask him if you want. I see you know each other. But I don't want to talk about it. Sorry, I need to tend to other customers." "Of course." Willam nodded absently. He finished the food on his tray, and getting up from the table, headed toward the red-haired giant. The priest in the black cassock gave Willam a heavy look, but remained silent. The red-haired guest looked up as Willam's shadow fell across his table. "Well, hello, O'Neill," Willam said, sitting down across from him. "Long time no see." "Not that long, Willam," his companion replied calmly. "How long has it been since you left the Legion?" 3 years? 4? 3.5? Willam nodded, sipping beer from his mug. "You should remember. Since the day I threw my badge with the royal seal and left, accompanied by cries of betrayal and broken oaths." "You really broke your oath then," O'Neill said slowly. "Because when I swore an oath to King Alfred, New Sussex was allied with the Commonwealth," Willam retorted. "In Europe we defended not only Old Friesland, but also Alfred's damned uncle, who lost 50,000 men at Waterloo alone. We retreated from The Hague, Calais, and Dunkirk alongside the English. We prepared to defend that cursed island when the Imperial Revolution fleet was ready to invade, and we were among the first to land in Brittany, Normandy, and Friesland. We took Dresden for God's sake." "And how did King Edgar repay us?" "First he deposed the stadtholder in Old Friesland, putting that scoundrel Friedrich on the throne, and then he and his nephew wanted to seize the mouth of the Reverend Martin River. And you expect me to fight for someone who behaves like a treacherous coyote? Edgar may be busy in France now, but tomorrow—" "He's not busy anymore," O'Neill smirked. "They say he managed to get his man on the French throne, and now he's turned his attention to the New World. Rumor has it that Norwegian infantry is landing north of the Reverend Martin River. And you know what that means." "I know." Willam's face darkened. "Those beasts made a name for themselves at the taking of Hamburg and Vienna. If Edgar's deploying the Norman Guard, it means he's serious. This isn't just a conflict, it's a war of annihilation." "It seems so," the Irishman shrugged. "Edgar has long been frustrated that the Frisian River separates crown lands from his nephew and vassals' territories, and now the Russians are moving west toward Friesland. Already? Just 3 years ago they were crossing the Rocky Mountains." "Well, it's the Russians," the Irishman laughed. "They're greedier than a Dorian alligator. First, they gobble up all the land they can. Then they figure out why they need it. Now Tsar Boris's forts stand on Friesland's outskirts. And has there ever been a time in the past 500 years when the Russians didn't back the English? Those two bandits always work together, Willam said grimly. Poor Friesland. But still, he stubbornly shook his head. I hope to reach the Great Lakes before it's all over. And who says the English will crack the Frisian nut, even with the Russians? The barons of the Confederation will support the Commonwealth. They must understand that they'll be next. What about you, Patrick? Whose side will you take? My own, the Irishman smirked. I have no desire to fight for King Edgar, whose soldiers run rampant in Erie, but Friesland means nothing to me either. Fighting for foreign flags doesn't appeal to me, and I probably won't ever have my own. If I risk my hide, it'll be for something that pays well. In some ways, you're probably right, Willam said. What are you up to now? Hunting men, the Irishman replied calmly. Like in Maryland. Willam grimaced. But there are no runaway slaves in the Confederation. Almost no serfs left here either. Even old Manfred von Richthofen's father freed all his serfs. I won't stay in this dump for long, O'Neill laughed. I'm heading to Euskadi tomorrow. Runaway slaves are a thing of the past. Now I deal in specialty goods. Is that why Kurt's so on edge? Willam asked. Superstitious oaf, the Irishman sneered. What can you expect from him? Back home, we also talk a lot about tonight. We call it Samhain. But our demons stayed in Europe. These local ones don't scare me. What matters more is that a count in Euskadi promised me gold by weight for this prize. Will you show me what's causing all the fuss? Willam asked, noticing the Irishman's face change. Don't worry, I don't intend to take it. I need to get to Friesland as quickly as possible, and dealing in human trafficking is a dirty business, in my opinion. It won't be easy to take this prize from me. O'Neill smirked. Besides, having it isn't enough. You need to know someone who can appraise it and pay accordingly. The hunter's face showed a mix of caution and pride in his catch. So if you're not afraid... After California, it's hard to scare me, Willam grinned. But you've piqued my interest. I'd like to see the prisoner who makes the innkeeper fear for his immortal soul and has a count in Euskadi ready to pay a fortune. Show me. The Irishman nodded, finished his wine, and stood up, gesturing for Willam to follow. The other patrons barely noticed their departure, except for the priest, who watched them with pale blue eyes full of concern. You won't deny, dear friend, the Irishman said, that there are beings, not human, not beast, but strange creatures born from miserable, lustful, fanciful thoughts. Hans Heinz Uvers Alrauna. The Irishman and the Frisian climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor, where the guest rooms were. A dim glow from the end of the corridor barely dispelled the darkness. Luckily, it's just us here, the Irishman said, striking sparks with a flint and pulling out a candle. And it's always dark here. Luckily? Why? Because my goods spoil in the light, O'Neill smirked, lighting the candle. You'll see for yourself. An increasingly perplexed Willam followed the Irishman down the corridor, stopping at one of the doors. The key turned with a grating sound, and the door swung open. The Irishman made an inviting gesture and stepped inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, just a wooden cot with a fabric mattress. Opposite the wall was a large window covered with thick black cloth. Willam realized it was a blanket taken from the cot. O'Neill had done everything to let in as little light as possible. On the floor under the window, a thin white figure was curled up. Hearing the door open, it stirred, and a metallic clink was heard. Well, take a look. The Irishman stepped forward, bringing the candle closer. Willam was hard to surprise with the sight of a naked woman, but even he couldn't suppress a gasp at the sight of the prisoner shrinking into a dark corner. Her skin seemed to glow with a deathly white light, reminiscent of the phosphorescence of rotting wood, fireflies, or will-o'-the-wisps. A similar pale glow flickered on her long, light hair, covering her body down to her thighs. Flowing and curling with every slight movement of the girl, the hair seemed to live its own life. Through the strands, delicate breasts with bright red nipples were visible. The flawless, sculptural perfection of the body seemed free of any flaws, as did the face. Beautifully shaped lips, a graceful chin, marred only by excessive pallor. No man could look at this girl without feeling desire, but it would be shameful and unnatural. For in this beautiful and terrifying creature, there was something subtly inhuman. This impression was heightened by her small, upturned nose, whose delicate nostrils constantly quivered as if sniffing. The prisoner's eyes were covered with a thick black blindfold, and her hands and feet were shackled with heavy chains, one end of which was attached to the cot's leg. "Well," the Irishman whispered with obvious pride. "Isn't she lovely?" "And who is she?" Willam asked. "Have you ever heard of the cave people?" the Irishman answered with a question. "That's just fairy tales," Willam exclaimed. "Are you saying that?" "Look." The hunter stepped forward and, before the girl could recoil, tore off her blindfold. Willam involuntarily stepped back. He had never seen such eyes, pale gray, merging with the whites, with what seemed like a black pinprick in the center. In those terrible eyes, there was nothing human, the focused gaze of a predator stalking its prey. Just imagining what this cave girl might be thinking made the battle-hardened mercenary shiver. As if sensing his unease, the girl lifted her upper lip in a ghastly grin, revealing well-developed sharp teeth. "Don't look at her too long," the Irishman warned, stepping forward and placing the candle on the cot. The girl shrank back to the wall, clinking her chains, but O'Neill grabbed her hair, forcing her head back and preventing her from biting his hand. With his free hand, he replaced the blindfold over her eyes. The entire time, the girl didn't make a sound, and this seemed the most eerie to Willam. "Well?" the Irishman asked, looking up. "Satisfied?" "Yes," Willam croaked, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Then let's go wet our whistles." Back in the tavern, the same patrons remained, and the burly Kurt glanced sideways from behind the bar at the soldier of fortune hunched over his beer mug. "You should know the history of these places as well as I do," the bounty hunter said. "About how the Norman settlers spread from Markland to the current border of New Sussex and Euskadi. How the war broke out between pagans and Christians, with the Catholics being defeated and driven north. And how Mirkwood was founded, a kingdom of blood, pain, and black magic, so horrifying that even their Viking ancestors would be appalled, and even the red-skinned savages fled west, calling this land wild and bloody. And how the defeated Christians, along with Basque sailors, sent an embassy to the Holy See to organize a crusade. Don't recite a local parish school history lesson, Willam grimaced. I remember how the Order of St. Walpurga was founded. But Mirkwood fell almost 4 centuries ago. Pagan women were given to German settlers, and their children were raised in the true Catholic faith. Now everyone here is a good Christian, well, mostly. I've heard the legends that some pagans fled into the depths of the forests and caves, but that was long ago. And all the fugitives have long since died. Not all, the Irishman whispered fervently. They were hunted down, chased through the woods like wild animals, driven out by European colonists joining the order. But some survived, to become the monsters that frighten children. In Ireland, they talk about the hill people, who steal children from good Catholics' cradles and replace them with their own changelings. Here, these legends have become reality, far more terrifying than any tales of our ancestors. His voice became hollow, as if coming from afar, and Willem van Hijn listened involuntarily, like hearing a scary story. You've heard of the Giant's Cave? I think I'm the first local to penetrate the heart of those caverns and emerge alive. That's the lair of these inhumans. After almost 500 years of living in caves, they no longer belong to the human race. They worship gods that even their pagan ancestors would shudder at. Those whom the Eddas and sagas mention in frightening hints, speaking of Jotuns, trolls, and dragons. I saw rocks painted with red and black depictions of multi-headed giants, wolves with snake heads and snakes with wolf heads. I saw the descendants of the accursed people bow before them and offer human sacrifices stolen from the surface. We shudder at the pagan rites of the Redskins, at the cruelties of the black shamans of California, but I swear by the providence of God, none have sunk to such satanic depths as this accursed tribe. They worship demons, and have become like them after centuries of inbreeding, cannibalism, and mating with creatures from the abyss. Their men resemble gray bears without fur, but the women are inhumanly, insanely beautiful, as evil can be beautiful. You must have heard stories of men falling in love with elf women, losing their heads to love and longing. But reality is more frightening than old tales. Cave demons lure men into ambushes, only to feast on human flesh with their husbands. But you're alive, Willam said. I wasn't seduced by a cave slut, O'Neill smirked. And God hasn't taken my sanity to touch one of them. The women are priestesses of the cave people. Like the shamans of the Redskins, they can lie motionless for hours while their souls commune with demons. That's how I caught this girl, lying as if dead by the waterfall, under the rock with the white dragon. And now you're taking her to sell? Willam clarified. Aren't you afraid? Me? The Irishman laughed. If I were afraid, I wouldn't have ventured into that cave. Outside, this girl is just a beautiful whore. In 2 days, I'll be in Euskadi, and by evening my employer will take her. She'll make me rich. He laughed again, but it sounded strained. Willam turned away, looking at the rapidly darkening window. Only now did it occur to him that the night of the hunt had just begun. They sat for a while, almost in silence, until Willam felt that fatigue and the beer had finally taken their toll. "Kurt," he called loudly. "You have a free room, don't you?" "Of course." The innkeeper approached the table where the mercenary and the bounty hunter sat, placing a key before Willam. "Third door on the right by the window." "Good." Willam stood up. "I'll leave you to your own devices, Patrick." "As you wish." The Irishman shrugged. "Good night." "This night is never peaceful," the innkeeper said grimly, watching Willam ascend to the second floor. Willam woke up in the middle of the night as if someone had nudged him hard in the side. For a while, he lay on his back, trying to understand what had happened. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he quickly scanned the room. Bare walls, a small stool beside his cot, roughly hewn ceiling boards. Nothing suspicious, yet something had woken him. Something that made him break out in a cold sweat and his heart pound wildly. He didn't understand what it was, but he felt danger, seeping into every pore of his body like icy mist. Then he heard it. Though the window was tightly shut with shutters, the sound that woke him was so loud it seemed to be right beside him. It was as if a young woman was sobbing her heart out in his room. The sobs and moans from outside were so mournful that Willam almost got up to open the window, but he froze. His years of ambushes, raids, and night fights had honed his intuition to sense the hidden threat in this sorrowful weeping. Outside, he heard a hoarse neigh, then a man's voice calling out to the unseen weeper. And Willam's blood ran cold. The sobbing abruptly turned into a harsh, triumphant laugh, choking with malevolent glee. There was a flapping of huge wings, a scream of pure terror cut off at its highest note, followed by the crunch of bones and revolting chomping. Without thinking of his own safety, Willam flung the shutters open. The black sky was studded with bright stars, the full moon casting strange shadows. Willam tracked one particularly odd shadow and couldn't suppress a gasp. His hand shot to the weapon lying on the stool as a fantastical, grotesquely hideous creature soared skyward. His hand with the pistol shot up, and he fired at the winged silhouette vanishing into the night. After a few shots, Willam realized he needed to save the bullets for something more tangible. Quickly dressing, the Frisian dashed into the corridor, where he came face to face with O'Neill. "What happened?" he asked, alarmed. "Were you shooting?" "Where's your girl?" Willam demanded. "Sleeping in the room," the Irishman replied warily. "What's it to you?" "She wasn't crying." "She's quiet as usual," Patrick shrugged. "So?" Without answering, Van Hine entered the room and shone the candle on the girl sitting in the corner. She was asleep, and it seemed genuine. Her chest rose and fell evenly. Her breathing was steady. "What the hell happened here?" the Irishman asked, as they quickly descended the stairs together. "I heard screams and crying." "It's what we were warned about," Willam said through gritted teeth. Downstairs, everyone who had been there earlier was still present, apparently not having had time to leave. One of the peasants was missing, and the other, white as marble, was stammering out a story to the gathered patrons of the Red Wolf in a voice that kept breaking into a shriek. "What happened, Hans?" the priest insisted. "What did you see?" "Oh, Lord, there, the peasant repeated like a broken record. The innkeeper poured a full glass of rum and handed it to the villager, who downed it in one gulp, choking and clinking his teeth against the glass. Only then could he manage to say something coherent, though even single-word answers came with great difficulty. Franz went to the horses. I lingered in the doorway. Then this crying. My sister cried like that when she was little. Franz called out, and then like lightning from above, pale as death, wings like Satan's himself, writhing ropes, white like a tangle of worms, a blazing eye, bright blue light. Franz didn't get 2 steps, and oh God in heaven, this thing bit him in half in one go. The last scream came out with the last of his strength, and the peasant, unable to process what he had experienced, collapsed in a faint. The priest looked up at the innkeeper, who grimly nodded in response, uttering just one word. "Snell Geist." The merchant standing nearby gasped and crossed himself, followed by Kurt and the priest. Even Willam flinched at the name he had once dismissed as mere foolish tales. The Irishman looked from one person to another in confusion. "What the hell?" he asked. "What the hell are you all talking about?" "You'd better keep quiet, you Irish dog!" Kurt spat with unexpected fury. "If you hadn't brought that thing here—" "What did you call me, you bastard?" The Irishman, instantly enraged, reached for his weapon. "Stop!" Willam was surprised to hear the priest raise his voice. "When Christians quarrel, the enemy wins the battle. How can you argue when a satanic spawn prowls around like a roaring lion?" Everyone fell into a sullen silence. "Father," Willam began, addressing the priest, but hesitated. "Dominic, my son, the rector of the Neheim and Kentuckburg diocese." "Father Dominic," the Frisian said respectfully, though it galled him to address a papist that way. "I've heard your peasants mention this creature, but they only crossed themselves at my questions, refusing to explain. What is it?" Dominic darkened, lowering his head. "They call it the Snell Geist, the swift spirit," he said grimly. "They say that on nights like this it crawls out from damp caves, from the banks of underground rivers. Some say it's a god of the red-skinned savages. Others talk of demons worshipped by the Normans. Some even speak of a witch who consorted with the devil and bore this creature. No one knows for sure, only that people disappear at night, and in the morning their bodies are found, mutilated in ways that no human or beast could inflict." Willam remembered the deer's carcass he had found. He couldn't recall exactly what the flying monster looked like. His memory seemed to block out the horrifying, unnatural sight. "What does the Snell Geist look like?" the Frisian finally asked. "Few survive an encounter with it," the priest shook his head. "Those who do describe it differently. Some say it resembles a bird whose wings can cover a small house. Others say the Snell Geist is like a giant bat, a dragon, or all three combined. It has a steel beak and huge teeth. Some say it has hooves. Others claim it has tentacles like an octopus. No one really knows. It's been years since this creature last emerged from its lair." "It wouldn't have come out now," Kurt spat, "if this fool hadn't brought a cave witch into my inn." "If he's a fool, then what are you for letting him in?" The priest raised his voice. "This isn't the time to argue about who's to blame. On the contrary, it's the perfect time." The innkeeper stubbornly shook his head. "If this creature summoned the monster with her spells—" "She's chained hand and foot," the Irishman exclaimed. "And she didn't make a sound while all this was happening. I slept next to her. I'd have heard. She hasn't said a word since she's been captured. Not every summons is spoken aloud." Father Dominic shook his head. "And if this creature is so powerful," Willam asked, "why didn't it wait for us to fall asleep and break in through the windows? Why isn't it trying to get into the house?" Dominic glanced at Kurt, who averted his eyes. "Because on every wall of this house," the innkeeper said hoarsely, "just below the roof there's a hex sign, a 7-pointed star that wards off evil spirits. My grandfather had a hex master carve them for 200 gold gulden when he built this house. Father, I know it's forbidden, but—" "We'll discuss this in the morning, my son," the priest said sternly. "If we have a morning. Will this creature leave with the sunlight?" the merchant asked hopefully. "It emerged on this night, the night of the hunt." "Possibly," Father Dominic shook his head doubtfully. "But—" "Quiet." Willam interrupted. "Do you hear that?" The arguers turned with puzzled expressions but fell silent for a moment. In the ensuing quiet, they heard the flapping of wings, followed by a heavy thud that made dust fall from the ceiling. Then came the scraping of giant claws on the roof, followed by hoofbeats. "It can't break in, can it?" the merchant asked fearfully. "It shouldn't," the innkeeper began, but stopped mid-sentence, mouth agape. Willam understood his reaction. He himself couldn't believe his ears at the sounds that followed. A song. Simply a song. A young female voice from above, harsh, staccato, like the clang of iron, yet strangely mesmerizing. Words in an unknown language seeped through the roof, slipping into the ears of the paralyzed listeners and wrapping around their hearts like cold, slimy leeches, draining their courage and injecting doubt and fear like venom. The hypnotic rhythm was reminiscent of the blasphemous prayers of voodoo priests, but their ritual chants lacked half the hidden, soul-destroying menace, perhaps because they were, after all, human. Gradually, the words of the song began to make sense to Willam. Once, on a distant northern island, he had heard this language. Old ones live in graves, cold corpses, serpents' children. What is it? Willam felt someone tug at his sleeve and turned to see Patrick. What in God's name is this devilry? Lord, save and protect us. Father Dominic made the sign of the cross repeatedly, cold sweat on his brow. Save and protect us. Took out the heart. Bodies gnawed, under wings of the dead. It can't break in. It can't. It can't. It can't, Kurt repeated like a mantra, crossing himself incessantly. He was shaking so violently it seemed everything around him, walls, tables, floor, was trembling with him. But Willam realized the floor was indeed shaking, harder and harder. A bottle of wine fell and shattered on the floor with a crash. "What's happening?" Patrick shouted in Willam's ear, but Willam couldn't answer in time. A horrific crack sounded and the floorboards exploded, sending splinters flying in all directions. A suffocating stench filled the room as something huge and black crawled out from beneath the floor. Saint Martin, Virgin Mary, Lord Jesus! Terrified screams echoed from all sides. Gunshots rang out, 1, 2, 3. But the corpse-stinking creature seemed unfazed by the bullets. It looked like a long, decayed corpse grown to the size of a large bear. Black-blue, rotting flesh, an almost bare skull with gnashing teeth, fat white worms writhing between the ribs. This blasphemous creature, an affront to the heavens, shouldn't exist. But it lived. It moved. It killed. Huge claws grabbed the nearest merchant, and the creature's teeth sank into his neck. The merchant's scream of mortal pain and terror was cut short as the monster nearly bit off his head in one snap. More gunshots followed, but the creature ignored them, tearing the merchant to shreds. "Be gone!" the priest shouted, holding a cross before him. "Be gone! Be gone!" The monster paid him no heed, growling as it devoured the bloody flesh. Willam involuntarily shook his head, dispelling the illusion. Did it seem to him, or was the creature growing larger with every bite, almost reaching the ceiling? He looked around. The bullets didn't harm it, but perhaps there was another way. The others were useless. Patrick was still firing, the priest muttered prayers, and Kurt was swaying back and forth, white as a sheet, looking ready to collapse into the blazing fireplace behind him. The fireplace. The idea struck Willam like a revelation. He tore a tablecloth from the nearest table, set it ablaze in the fireplace, and threw it over the creature. Simultaneously, he grabbed a fat bottle of whiskey from the bar and hurled it at the monster, which was trying to shake off the burning cloth. Blue flames roared up, turning the undead abomination into a massive bonfire. The creature's menacing growl turned into a pitiful howl, and it bolted for the window. On its way out, it grabbed the still unconscious Hans by the leg, flung him through the window, shattering the shutters, and leaped after him. At that moment, the flapping of wings resumed, and an ugly winged shadow loomed over the courtyard, enveloping the thrashing undead. Willam couldn't resist the temptation to finally see the horror of the night sky. He rushed to the window, knowing he was putting his life in grave danger. But his curiosity overpowered his fear. He reached the window just in time to see the steel-toothed beak clamp down on the head of the still growling undead. A flexible tail, covered in gray-white scales, coiled around the body, holding it tight as the dragon-like creature tore it apart. Willam stared wide-eyed at the Snell Geist. The priest had been right. This monstrosity defied coherent description in human language. It was a bird, a bat, a dragon, an octopus, all at once. Its shape shifted bizarrely, presenting a different appearance every second. Pieces of bodies littered the courtyard, shredded horses and the unfortunate peasant Franz, who had stepped out at the sound of the woman's crying. His brother, thrown out by the rampaging undead, was miraculously still alive. He had regained consciousness and managed to stagger a few steps toward the inn. But that was all he could do. The monster turned its hideous face towards him, and its single eye, burning with a dark blue fire, flared in the center of its forehead. Around its grotesque skull, many small tendrils began to writhe and extend. These tendrils quickly grew longer and thicker, transforming the creature into a gorgon-like horror. The hapless German barely managed a couple of steps before the white tentacles wrapped around his body. His agonized scream turned into a gurgling gasp as his body arched, and the tendrils turned red as they drained his blood. A noise behind Willam made him turn to see Father Dominic, red with anger, confronting a sheepishly defensive Kurt. "I didn't know! I swear to God I didn't know!" the innkeeper yelled. "Don't invoke the name of the Lord!" the priest shouted back. "You, spawn of Satan! You invited a hexmaster, didn't you? What else did you keep silent about? That he not only carved your signs, but also killed a man to bury in the house's foundation? You wanted a guardian for your inn. Well, did he protect Heinrich?" He pointed to the torn body of the merchant. "And Hans? And Franz? Do you think he'll protect you?" "But I truly didn't know." The innkeeper still tried to justify himself. "It was all my grandfather's doing." "Blasphemer? Sorcerer? And you still hope to see the morning?" "What are they talking about?" the Irishman asked, nodding towards the arguing men. "There's a belief," Willam said distractedly, "that if you kill someone and bury them in the foundation when building a house, it will stand for centuries. And if you invite a knowledgeable person, the spirit of the slain will become a guardian. No one will admit to doing this now, of course, but everyone knows half the local barons' castles stand on." Willam froze mid-sentence, looking out the window again, where the creature was still devouring the peasant's corpse. A sudden realization struck him. Damn it, how foolish he'd been. He thundered up the stairs, boots clattering. "Where are you going?" the Irishman shouted. "To see your witch." "Why?" "He's right," Kurt supported Willam. "I want to see too." "And I," added the priest. Scowling at the three men, the Irishman led them back upstairs. Kurt opened the door and shone the candle inside. The cave girl lay curled up under the window. Her head twitched, her slender throat swelled and fell, and her neck arched as her jaws snapped as if biting something. Willam remembered the California alligators. This was exactly how they swallowed chunks of flesh torn from corpses. A blush appeared on the witch's pale cheeks, and her thin lips were turning red before their eyes. Willam shook his head, approached the window, careful not to touch the cave spawn, and tore the cover from it. The full moon shone brightly in the sky, illuminating the courtyard where the creature spread its wings and soared into the night. The writhing white tendrils fluttered behind its grotesque head like a multitude of long maiden braids. "There's your Snell Geist," Willam said grimly, nodding at the sleeping cave girl. "Patrick, you really are a fool." "What are you talking about?" the Irishman asked, casually laying a hand on his pistol. "Tell me again. How did you catch her?" "Well, she was lying asleep under the rock," the Irishman began. "Have you never heard that a witch might have more than one soul?" Willam interrupted. "All pagans believe that. Some say a witch or a sorcerer is born with it, while others say it's a demon given to them after initiation. From their own blood and the remains of various creatures, the sorcerer creates a body for their second soul. The Snell Geist is such a creature." Willam threw his hand toward the window. "This beast is one with your captive." "Oh God," Kurt crossed himself with a trembling hand, and the priest began muttering a prayer. The captive girl stirred, her knees drawn up, her predatory eyes warily shifting from one person to another. With a shudder, Willam realized that the underground witch understood perfectly what they were saying. "What are you talking about?" the Irishman exclaimed. "How can that be? Did you see that creature? Did you see the undead thing tear a man apart like a rotten rag? Why ask stupid questions? Your greed and ignorance will doom us all. If that's the case, why didn't it devour me right away?" O'Neill persisted. "In the cave or on the way out?" "I don't know." Willam shrugged. "Maybe. Who knows where this witch sent her second soul? Perhaps into such depths that the creature couldn't get out quickly. By the time it started looking for you, you were already on the surface. And during the day," added Father Dominic. "But on the witching night, the foul thing came out. Willam was right. You're a fool." Okay, I admit it," the Irishman nodded hastily. "I messed up, but still, the creature can't get into the house and it will disappear by morning. Then I can continue my journey." Kurt cursed elaborately, and Willam agreed with him. The Irishman's carelessness was infuriating. Yes, they both were used to staring death in the face, but this was far from an ordinary death. Willam saw that Patrick was as scared as the rest of them, but greed and stubbornness wouldn't let him accept the loss of his goods. "Look," the priest exclaimed. "What's happening to her again?" Willam looked at the girl. She had gone limp in her chains, her head drooping to the side. Her eyes were glazed, a thin stream of saliva ran from the corner of her mouth, but her chest heaved as if she had been running for a long time. A wheezing, whistling breath escaped her lips. Willam rushed to the window and opened the shutters. A full moon bathed his face in light, and against its pale glow, a winged silhouette was clearly approaching. The night was once again pierced by a terrible scream. "Is it getting bigger?" Kurt exclaimed in amazement. "Yes." Willam squinted, observing the creature, which had indeed nearly doubled in size. "The legends said so," the priest nodded grimly. "The Snell Geist came, no bigger than a crane, but as it devoured people it grew to the size of a house, and its sorcery grew with it. Now even your hex sign may not help, Kurt." "Damn." The innkeeper glanced nervously at the window. "Don't curse." "What should we do?" the Irishman exclaimed, seemingly resigned to the loss of his goods. "Give the girl to the Snell Geist," Willam said decisively. "Maybe it will be satisfied." "No!" The priest's voice was unexpectedly firm. "Never." "Why not?" "This house is already excessively desecrated by witchcraft," said Father Dominic, his eyes gleaming with fanatical light. "We won't damn our souls by bargaining with this creature." "Bargaining. No matter what this witch is, she didn't come to us from the cave. She was dragged here by force. We're already guilty before her." "Don't blaspheme." The priest's voice cracked like a whip. "I know all Frisians are heretics, but I didn't think they were ready to surrender to the enemy. It doesn't matter how this witch ended up here. She's a devil's spawn, and it is the true Christian's duty to destroy her. God probably instilled excessive greed in the Irishman to deliver this cave witch into our hands. Our ancestors didn't eradicate this filth with fire and sword for us to grovel before it now." "And what are you going to do with her?" "Her fate is the stake. Maybe then God will allow us to see the morning." Willam glanced from the girl on the floor to the faces of his companions, and saw they fully agreed with the priest. Even the Irishman's papist inclinations resurfaced, despite his many years as a mercenary. Like Kurt, facing dark forces, He was ready to acknowledge Father Dominic as their spiritual leader. All three tried to drown their panic with religious fanaticism. "Over my dead body." Willam stepped forward, reaching for his pistol, but all three men lunged at him. He managed to fire, but at that moment something heavy struck the back of his head. A bright flash exploded before his eyes, and everything went black. In nomine Patris et Spiritus Sancti. A multitude of sounds broke through the thick darkness of unconsciousness. Half-familiar Latin words of a prayer mingled with metallic clanging and pitiful wailing. Willam opened his eyes, barely managing to separate his lashes, sticky with dried blood, and looked around. He was lying in the downstairs hall, thrown onto one of the tables, bound hand and foot like a Christmas goose. The Frisian turned his head, almost gasping from the excruciating pain pulsating through his skull. "Judica, Domine, expugna impugnantes." Kurt was busy at the fireplace, throwing log after log into the growing flames. Next to him, as if lined up for a final battle, stood numerous bottles of various shapes and sizes. Evidently, the innkeeper had raided his cellar extensively. Father Dominic stood nearby, detached from all worldly matters as a true spiritual shepherd, reciting prayers over the Irishman sitting on the floor. "Sancte Michael Archangele, adversus principes et potestates, contra spiritualia nequitiae." Listening to the priest, Patrick O'Neill held the cave girl by her long hair. Even bound hand and foot, the witch's serpentine, boneless writhing made it difficult for the bounty hunter to keep her under control. From her crimson lips, still no sound emerged, and this silent, desperate struggle had a particularly eerie quality. "Exe crucem Domini, fugite partes." In response, from outside came maniacal laughter and a woman sobbing, howling, whistling, furious cursing as if spewed by 100 mouths. Wings flapped, huge claws scraped the wall, and an enormous blue eye, filled with hatred for humanity, appeared repeatedly in the shattered window. However, the creature couldn't break in. The hexmaster who had carved the protective symbols on the house walls knew his craft. The trio at the fireplace did their best to ignore the monster, though the priest's voice trembled, and the innkeeper's hands shook as he stoked the fire. They tried not to look at Willam, only Kurt, noticeably limping, cast a resentful glance at the Frisian. Willam noticed his right leg was wrapped in a cloth, a dark stain spreading across it. Evidently his shot had found its mark. The incoherent yells outside turned into loud chanting, reminiscent of the chants the Snell Geist had used to raise the undead from under the floor. The walls shook again. Dust rose in clouds. But through it, Willam saw something strange happening to the inn. At first he thought his eyes were deceiving him, but no. He clearly saw pale gray spots forming on the walls and ceiling, quickly turning tar black. They expanded, merging, covering the walls with oily blots and streaks, emitting a nauseating stench. Willam looked up and saw black drops swelling on the ceiling above him. One fell next to him on the table, the fine spray burning his skin like hot oil. Shuddering, he thought about what would happen if this filth got into his eyes. Meanwhile, the oily substance defied nature, rolling across the ceiling in black globules like mercury, converging into a single spot on the wall above the tightly closed door near the ceiling. There, under a layer of foul-smelling slime, a faint golden 7-pointed star glowed. The priest, the innkeeper, and the bounty hunter were just as terrified as Willam, but unlike him, they could at least do something. The priest finished his prayer, crossing the Irishman and the struggling witch with a sweeping motion, the girl now barely resembling a human. The fire roared in the fireplace as Kurt turned around, holding something Willam initially mistook for another log. But it wasn't a log. It was an axe. From the crazed glint in the innkeeper's eyes, Willam realized that Kurt had lost his mind from all they had been through. The Irishman threw the girl at the innkeeper's feet, and she rolled across the floor, struggling to stand. At that moment, with a deranged grimace, Kurt brought the axe down with a shuddering sob. A deafening, shrieking scream echoed from outside, the creature's massive body slamming against the wall, shaking the house. Spurred on by the scream, Kurt repeatedly swung the axe, delivering brutal blows. Soon, his hands, face, and chest were covered in blood, but he kept hacking at the body, thrashing at his feet like a decapitated snake. Blood splattered on the priest's cassock, and droplets hit his face. But Father Dominic, seemingly oblivious, continued his prayer, crossing Kurt and the dying witch with sweeping motions and crossing himself. Exorcizamus te, omnis immundus spiritus, omnis satanica potestas, omnis incursio infernalis adversarii, omnis legio, omnis congregatio, in nomine et virtute Domini nostri. Kurt, now in a frenzy, chopped off the witch's hands and feet, hacked the torn body apart, spilling its innards. The Irishman grabbed the severed pieces of flesh and threw them into the fire. When Kurt was exhausted, Patrick snatched the axe from him and continued to hack at the bloodied, writhing pile on the floor. Incredibly, the dismembered creature still lived, still twitched and writhed, and so did the Snell Geist outside, howling in agony. Willam knew the local superstition. Demons possessing a witch's body could be reborn from the smallest part of her flesh. Just burning the body was not enough. Every limb had to be separated, every bone scattered to leave no way for the evil spirit to return. The land of the Confederacy preserved many secret rites and strange customs, and Willam realized that the cursed legacy of Mirkvid had not only survived in the caves. The sorcery of the defeated Northerners had taken root among the descendants of the crusading order. The black slime accumulating around the hex sign finally ate through the wood, breaking the magical protection. There was a cracking sound and a gnashing skull, its flesh bubbling from the heat, pushed through the hole near the ceiling. The creature lunged inside, but the axe fell once more. Covered in blood, the Irishman straightened, holding the girl's head by her hair. Strangely, her face remained unscathed, as inhumanly beautiful as it had been in life. Cursing, the Irishman slammed the severed head onto the floor, then struck it with the axe and threw the shattered skull into the fire. The light hair, curling like dying snakes, crackled and flared up in the flames. Shuddering with revulsion, Willam glanced at the door. There was a gaping hole above it, but the vile face was gone. The black stains on the ceiling dried up before his eyes, crumbling into dark dust. From outside came incoherent muttering, increasingly drowned out by the priest's voice. Draco maledicte et omnis legio diabolica, adjuramus te per deum vivum, per deum verum. Mutilated chunks of flesh flew into the fire, where Kurt poured the contents of opened bottles. Navarrese rum, Dorian grappa, whiskey, schnapps. The entire stock of strong drinks the innkeeper had went into fueling the enormous pyre, purifying the demon-tainted flesh. The Irishman did the same, taking a swig from each bottle before tossing it. Kurt, unable to bear the horror sober, drank as well. Only by some miracle did the fire not spread beyond the hearth. Silence fell outside. The priest finished his prayer, crossed himself, and with difficulty got up and approached Willam. The Frisian tensed, seeing the knife in his hand. "Don't worry, my son." The priest bowed his head. "I won't harm you. It was a vile deed, but God knows it was necessary." "Untie me," Willam croaked, and Father Dominic, hesitating, began to cut the ropes, avoiding eye contact with the Frisian. Finished, the priest hurriedly stepped back, but even if Willam had wanted to, he couldn't do anything to him. His limbs, bound tightly by the ropes, took time to regain proper blood flow. Ignoring Kurt and Patrick, who watched him warily, Willam van Hyn walked to the shattered window and looked outside. Before the inn, in a pool of dark pink pus, lay a decaying mass of flesh and crumbling bones. Willam lifted his eyes. The night sky was lightening, and in the distance, beyond the tree branches, the faint glow of dawn shimmered. Willam left the Red Wolf Inn without a word, not exchanging a single word with anyone. No one seemed inclined to talk. Patrick brooded over his beer. Kurt started cleaning up the thoroughly soiled inn, still limping and glaring at the Frisian. Only the priest tried once more to speak with the mercenary, but Willam gestured that he didn't want to talk. During the day, Willam bought a sturdy bay mare in Neheim and headed north, crossing the borders of baronies and bishoprics, passing mighty castles perched on cliff tops, carefully avoiding towns and villages. He only looked back once, at the end of the first day, when he climbed to the top of a large hill. Behind him the sun was setting, painting the sky a bloody crimson. Patrick hoped to drown the recent horror in drink. By evening, drunk on beer, he collapsed onto his bed and quickly fell asleep. A terrible scream from Patrick's room made Kurt drop his bottle of wine and rush upstairs. With shaking hands, he unlocked the door with a spare key and stepped inside. By the window lay the Irishman's body, mutilated and broken as if crushed with immense force. Uninjured patches of flesh alternated with horrifying bruises and contusions, red-blue streaks wrapping around the corpse. The mess of skin, flesh, and shattered bones, fragments protruding from the mangled flesh. The blackened, rigid tongue lolled out of his mouth, frozen in a silent scream. Kurt's eyes caught on a small white spot next to the mangled body. He bent down, picking up the strange object, a large, coin-sized hard scale. Behind him came a rustling sound that made the innkeeper's blood run cold. Slowly, as if walking to the gallows, Kurt turned. His eyes widened, his mouth opened, but he didn't have time to scream. Willam smirked, recalling his conversation with O'Neill. The Irishman had traveled so long away from his kin that it was no wonder he got the date of the Celtic Day of the Dead wrong, rashly linking it with the local legend. A mistake, true, only by one day. But even that could be fatal. "It seems to me, Patrick, that you got off easy," the Frisian muttered, reaching into his saddlebag. When he withdrew his hand, it held a lock of light hair, strangely glinting in the setting sun's rays. Willam had picked it up and absently shoved it into his bag when he went up to retrieve his belongings that morning. Apparently, when the three men dragged the cave witch downstairs, she had fought back, leaving clumps of hair stained with someone's blood on the steps. Willam opened his fingers. The lock of hair flew into the bushes, writhing like a snake in the air. Moments later, from the dense thickets came a loud hissing, and the branches swayed as if a strong body was forcing its way through them. As if compelled by some unseen force, Willam raised his head and looked at the peaks of the distant hills. Did it seem to him, or did a shadow of a giant rider in a knight's helmet really flicker there, followed by a ghostly pack of some unidentifiable creatures? The vision disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but Willam was certain it was real. The mercenary shook his head and spurred his horse. Behind him lay the enchanted south, with its undead witches and winged monsters spreading terror in the night. Ahead awaited dense forests and vast lakes, great battles, and a normal enemy who died from a simple, honest bullet. Ahead lay Frisia. Patrick decided not to leave Neheim immediately. After losing his goods, it was better not to show his face to his employer. However, he still had the money from the advance payment, and since he had paid for his room for 3 days in advance, he decided to stay at the Red Wolf, especially as Kurt wasn't accepting visitors while he put the inn back in order.